Good evening all and welcome. Before the video begins, I have a quick announcement. To anyone who signs up to my $10 tier on Patreon is going to get all these gifts sent to them in the mail. All these stickers, including your favourite cryptids, Demon, Bigfoot, Skinwalker, Black-Eyed Kid, and the whole cryptid crew right there. Mortis media stickers and a Let the Darkness Take Control one. 2 for good measure, a bunch of them, not just once, as well as a special message from me on a postcard that I probably made myself straight to you, something fun to keep. Also, a bunch of extra stuff is on Patreon, like an 18-minute narration I just made on there quite recently, and loads of other bonus content that you'll probably enjoy. If this is something that you like, feel free to check it out, link in the top of the description, and if not, that's cool too. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I work in a children's emergency room, and have seen and heard my fair share of things. I have multiple stories, but this one always sticks out to me, but not in a scary way. Several years ago, I was working third shift, and it had been an unfortunate evening. We had lost a child, a regular patient of the ED, earlier in my shift, and, well, that's something that stays with you. However, working in this environment, you have to go on with your day. You're allowed to mourn, but for 12 hours you are there to help every child that comes through those doors. Usually around 3 AM the ED is able to start closing down hallways due to the lower volume of patients, and that night I decided to take a much needed break away from the noise in one of the hallways we had just closed. I was hiding away in the unit secretary area of the hallway when I heard a child's laugh and footsteps running down the hallway into a room. Again, this isn't a particularly unusual thing, because we have children everywhere in the hospital. However, I wanted to investigate, because there shouldn't be a child running around unattended in the closed area of the ED. I walk in the room where I heard the child, and it was completely empty, with the lights still being off. Behind me I heard the same thing, but in another room, but this time the lights were switched on. Again, I go investigate and it was empty. Confused, I turned off the lights and went back to the desk. I sit there for a few minutes and see the light switch back on in one of the rooms, and shortly after I hear the same laugh. I get up and start walking to the room, and as I get close I hear the same laugh and the light switches right back off when I get there. At this point I can hear my heart pounding through my chest. I knew something wasn't right. I walk into the room and turn on the light, and my heart drops. Sitting on the bed is the patient I had come to know very well throughout the years. It was the patient I watched pass away several hours ago in our trauma room. I immediately started tearing up, and I remember wanting to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. He looked at me, smiled and then laughed, and just like that, he was gone. I haven't seen him since that night. Maybe I was sleep deprived and seeing things. But in that moment I felt a sense of peace. I knew he was okay. It is definitely an experience that I will never forget, and honestly one that I never want to forget. Back when I was 18, my mum and I had been doing work in the garden, so she was exhausted and went to bed early. It was winter, so it got dark early. I knew I would be the only one awake for the next few hours, until her partner got in from working at 4 AM. I went about my usual nightly routine. I rolled a joint, and went out back to smoke it, as I did every night, as I was not allowed to smoke in the house. The house had 2 floors, and my bedroom was on the top floor. After I had my smoke, I went back upstairs and continued watching whatever. About an hour later, I decided I would have one more joint before going to bed. I finished rolling and got myself ready to head out into the cold. But just before I went down the stairs, something on my phone distracted me, and I sat back on the bed concentrating on that. When a minute or two passed, I heard a loud bang from downstairs. I thought to myself it was just my mum's partner coming home. Then seconds later, I realized I didn't hear the front gate open, and didn't hear the taxi pull up outside. I didn't hear the front door open, and my cat is on the bed next to me, so it wasn't him, and my mum was asleep the next door over. So what could that bang possibly be? I grabbed my taser, which funnily enough looks like a Nokia phone so that my mum also didn't know about it, and stuck it in my dressing gown pocket and go into my mum's room. Normally she's a very light sleeper, but because she was tired from gardening, she slept through the noise. I wake her up and tell her what I've heard. She gets herself ready, grabs a metal pole, and we head downstairs. I insisted on going first because, in all fairness, my mum is like 5'6" and 130 pounds, has multiple sclerosis, and is holding a flimsy metal pole. I figured my taser would be a little better should we encounter anyone. Looking around, everything seems fine. However, the last room we check is the bathroom, which is on the lower ground floor, to find that the window that sits just above the bath is wide open, with one of our 2 bottles of Tresemme shampoo and conditioner, which were on the windowsill, have been knocked into the bath, creating the loud bang. Of course, we're like, how could this happen? The wind, perhaps? Obviously not. We were just really scared and trying to make ourselves feel better. It's 2:30 AM at this point, and my mum calls her partner to tell him someone has just tried to break in through the window and to please come home. His response, it's probably just a fox or something. Close it and go back to bed. You're just being paranoid. So we're like, well, you're no help, and we make sure everything is secure and call 101, the UK's non-emergency police, to report it. 5 minutes later, 4 police cars and dogs all turn up. They look around and then come to the door and ask the obvious questions. After doing a walk around the house and area, they come back again and ask if we usually keep our plastic garden chairs under the bathroom window. No. The police advise us that a dodgy gang have been doing strange things about the area, trying to break in through windows and steal whatever they can. They must have taken the garden chairs to stand on to help them get in. The police also advised that a house a few streets over had just been broken into, and everything was taken and the house was destroyed on the inside. I don't think they ever got caught. The thing that freaks me out the most is, had I not got distracted with my phone before going out back to smoke, I would have been outside sitting on the same chairs in the pitch darkness, where the intruders would have come around and seen me, and God knows what would have happened to me, as our outdoor light was broke. So to whoever tried to break into my house that night, let's keep it this way, and never meet. When I was almost 12, the woman living above me was a coke dealer. The night of my 12th birthday, she went missing. Not long after, her boyfriend came down to ask if he could use our phone. This was 2004, so having a cell phone was more of an exception to the rule, at least in my area. For a little context, I was home alone a lot of the time, while my mum was at work about a 5-minute walk away. My mum had let our neighbour and her boyfriend come in to use our phone several other times before, so I assumed nothing was wrong with it, and let him in, bringing him into the living room, which is towards the front of our apartment, to use the phone in there. He picks up the receiver, dials a number, waits a few seconds, then hangs up the phone. He does this a few more times before the front door of the building opens. You can easily hear the front door open from where we are, as it's a heavy door, and the walls are very thin. It's just the way our apartment is set up. Me and my mum's apartment was the only one on the first floor, and our upstairs neighbour's apartment was the only one above us. My neighbour's boyfriend looked at me, put his finger to his lips, like he was trying to shush me, and told me not to tell anyone he was there before speed walking to my room at the other end of the apartment. I watched my bedroom door close right before there was a loud, hard, cop-like knock on the door. My jaw dropped as I opened the door to see a cop. He asked if my neighbour's boyfriend was there, and being scared, I stammered out, "Yeah, he just went into my room." The officer asked if he could come in, to which I agreed, and as he was coming in, he asked if I could get his partner in the back door and lead them to my room. We walked together to the back of the apartment and I let in his partner. The back door to the apartment was right next to my bedroom door, but we had to walk around the kitchen table to get there. There was just barely enough space between the two doors to fit a narrow rectangular table against it without blocking the path to either door. After I let them into my room, I watched as they pulled my neighbor's boyfriend out of my bedroom closet, as they brought him out of my room and towards the back door, which led to an enclosed fire escape. They told me to go wait in the living room while they brought him out the back door. I walked back to the living room, and after they closed the door, I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could hear the distinct sound of metal clinking and quickly realized that he had just been handcuffed. Still scared, I waited for the police car to drive away before grabbing my keys, making sure the back door was locked, and locking the front door on my way out before running to my mum's work crying. I'm pretty sure I cut the 5-minute trip to about 2, and I've never been a faster runner. I was fueled entirely on adrenaline and fear at that point. I just wanted my mum. When I told her what happened, my mum was pissed that he had used me the way he had, hiding out in a child's bedroom closet, of all the places to try and keep the cops from finding him. She gave me a short but gentle lecture that night about not letting people in to use the phone, telling me that I was not to let people use our phone even if I knew them unless she was home. I didn't know what exactly he wanted from us, nor do I know what would have happened if the cops hadn't have shown up. I don't know if he had known that the cops were on their way, and he had come to my apartment specifically to hide from them, or if he was up to something else and knew it was the cops when the front door building opened. Our upstairs neighbor's boyfriend, let's never meet again. As much as I do believe in the paranormal, I don't usually get the opportunity to experience it firsthand. I want to start off by saying that being from Hawaii, there are many superstitions that I still follow to this day, in respecting my ancestors and understanding my culture. I work in the film industry, and sometimes where we shoot tends to be in certain sacred locations back in the old Hawaiian days. For example, if it was just me on a hiking trip, I would have done to chant an oli to grant me safe passage. However, this job pretty much disregards those types of locations if it's considered a tourist area. We were filming at Waimea Falls, which has a rich history of the paranormal, located on the island of Oahu. As the day was wrapping up, I found out one of the crew members left some equipment back at the falls, and I volunteered on retrieving it. It was completely dark, and it was about a 10-minute drive via a quad to trek up the narrow path towards the falls. I had a colleague help me in locating it in the forest to no avail. I kept feeling eyes were watching us, and we shouldn't linger any longer. We decided to leave and got back on the four-wheeler to head back to base camp. As my colleague was trying to fix the gear, the headlights were beaming our exit. I glanced over to see a shadowy figure standing in the middle of our path. Thinking in my head, that's not right. I looked away, hoping it was only an illusion of some kind. I blinked, hoping I wasn't crazy, and I turned to see if the figure was still there. To my horror, the shadow figure stood 10 feet away from me, blocking our path in front of the headlights. Mind you, these lights were on high beam, illuminating the front road and all the darkness tucked far back except for the figure. Trying not to cause any alarm to my colleague who didn't want to notice the figure, I quickly closed my eyes shut and told him to hurry up and drive. He asked what was wrong, but I didn't budge until we were back in our well-lit environment. I felt ashamed for causing a disturbance even though it was unintentional. I sent a prayer before my departure and hoped the being could remain at peace, but that experience was a shocker for the first time. Thankfully, it didn't follow me home. This incident happened last year in 2019. Unfortunately, I don't have any proof for the fact that I was completely chicken under those circumstances. Mahalo nui loa for reading this story. And please do not piss off any ghosts on your excursions, people. This is a story from my childhood, one of the ones that haunts me to this day. Have you ever seen those memes where it says people react like a criminal when an unexpected visitor arrives at their doorstep? They freeze and drop everything they're doing and throw themselves to the floor to avoid being seen in the window. This is my story of how I became one of those people. At the time, I must have been around 7.5. I was visiting the Midwest, Kansas to be exact, from South Korea, where I was born and raised, and was just visiting family. Nothing major. On that particular night, the adults, our auntie, uncle, and parents, were going to have a date night, so our parents ordered us a pizza before they left and waited for it to arrive, so that we wouldn't have to open the door for anyone. My aunt and uncle had 2 kids, 2 boys, 15 and 8. I was about 7.5 at the time. My older sister was 11 and our baby brother was the young, tender age of 3. So all in all, we're ready to just have a fun night of games. After all, it wasn't often the cousins got together like this. They lived in the States and we lived in Korea, but we all loved each other dearly. We saw our parents out at the garage entryway. They made sure we knew the rules and we could recite them back to them. They also made sure we knew where the telephones were and the emergency numbers to accompany them. It's just gonna be a typical night of no parents. Or so we thought. It had been maybe an hour after our parents had departed. We were downstairs in the basement in the playroom and were just watching a movie, playing air hockey, and being kids in general. We weren't being loud or anything, and even if we were, it wasn't much of a big deal, because the way houses were in Kansas, the basement are built in the ground in case of a tornado. I'd gone upstairs with my oldest cousin because I wanted to drink some chocolate milk and couldn't reach the cups alone, so we wandered upstairs into the kitchen, which was on the far end of the house. The others stayed downstairs continuing their games. We had maybe been upstairs for 15 to 20 minutes before, while I was drinking my milk, my older cousin was making snacks since we were planning to watch a movie. Then all of a sudden we hear the doorbell ring. I remember my cousin looked at me and told me to stay here because it was odd that the doorbell was ringing and it wasn't too late, but it certainly wasn't early. And I say this because it was summer. It was around 8 o'clock. My cousin started to creep towards the door quietly. It was unnerving for someone to be ringing the doorbell. We weren't expecting any guests. The pizza had been delivered before our parents had even left. And before he's even halfway to the door, whoever is on the other side starts rapidly ringing the doorbell over and over. The consistent ring echoed through the house, and by this point I had looked over towards the staircase and saw our other siblings starting to creep up the stairs, with the exclusion of the baby, who was still asleep in the crib in the guest room. The oldest of the kids, James, put his finger to his lips and told us to be quiet, to make it seem like no one was home, despite there being lights on. He crept closer to the door as the banging and ringing on the doorbell continued as he peeked through the peephole. I had never seen my cousin look so freaked out. His face drained of color as he backed away from the door rapidly, and he told us to go downstairs, but of course we didn't listen. Honestly, we thought he was playing a joke. Maybe it was some of his friends wanting to scare us, since he did cancel his plans that night to stay home and watch all of us kids. My older sister shoved past him and looked through the peephole herself, and for whatever reason, whatever was on the other side of the door made her have the exact same reaction, and she stumbled back from the door pale. At the time, I didn't really understand what was going on. I don't think any of us younger kids really did, but something wasn't right. After 20 minutes, whoever was at the door stopped ringing the doorbell and all was quiet again. It seemed like they gave up. Maybe they thought no one was home. If only we knew how wrong we really were. We all sat in silence for a while after this initially occurred. My other cousin, Kyle, mustered up the courage to ask his brother James who was at the door and why James and my sister were acting so skittish. James told us there was a man wearing dark clothes and seemed to be carrying some type of package or large box, but he couldn't see his face. Of course, Kyle, being the little smarty pants he was, started to mock James, saying he was just being a scaredy cat and didn't recognize their neighbors. Kyle was convinced it was a neighbor dropping off a package that may have gotten mixed up in the mail, seeing as it happened all the time. So we agreed that this was probably the cause, until we realized whoever was ringing the doorbell didn't just leave the package on the porch. Which, isn't that what most neighbors do? In the case of no one answers, they'll just leave it. And why would they try to bring it over in the house at night instead of just waiting until the next day? But we thought it was over and done with, so we pushed it to the back of our minds. We didn't think it was important to call our parents and let them know what happened. It was over after all. We went back to the kitchen, grabbed the snacks, and started to head back downstairs until we heard banging again. It wasn't from the front porch this time, though. We were in shock. We froze in fear. It was coming from right behind us. We slowly turned and looked back in the direction from which we came from. We were currently standing in the dining room. We had already passed through the kitchen. It was like someone was banging on the kitchen window. You know, the ones that are typically above the sink, so your mother or father can watch the kids while they play in the backyard as they do the dishes. So James and my older sister Nicole got down on their hands and knees and they crawled back into the kitchen, much against our charging. Just as quickly as they crawled into the kitchen to take a peek, they crawled back out in almost hyperspeed and told us to get low and stay low as we crawled into the den further down the hallway. James had us huddled close to the fireplace, out of sight from the windows, and he told us to stay there. He was taking charge. He was protecting his home and family the best way he knew how. James quickly crawled away. I don't know where he was going, but I was scared. The banging was getting louder, and it was getting closer and closer. At some point I started to cry and remember Kyle put his hand over my mouth and my sister was hugging us tight. And around that time we saw James starting to appear back around the corner, baseball bat in hand. He crawled up another staircase to get to his room. He crawled past us and put a finger on his lips, and that's when we realized he was crawling towards the doggy door. He was attempting to close off one entrance to the house that wasn't locked. Thankfully, he managed to get it latched in time because we don't think the man outside had realized that the house had a doggy door. But when we heard the lock click into place, the banging became more erratic and more violent. Then all of a sudden, much like before, the banging stopped, but we heard pacing. Someone was walking back and forth across the porch, slowly, deliberately. Thump, thump, thump. His heavy boots thundered across the red oak porch, and then without warning the pacing stopped, and it became quiet, eerily quiet. Then the man called out, "Won't you open the door? I have a package for you." We didn't respond. We stayed quiet, or as quiet as we could be, with the way our hearts were pounding and how ragged our breath was. The stranger called out again, "Open the door," and again. We didn't answer. The man called out angrily, "I said open the door, I have a package." Like before, we didn't answer, nor did we make any sudden movements. The man banged again, this time directly on the panel window of the room we were sitting in. "I know you're there. I know you can hear me. Open the door or I'll open it for you." He continued banging. The window rattled and shook violently with each impact from the strange man. Thankfully, our cousin's house had reinforced windows, so they weren't easy to break. But unluckily, we didn't have any nearby neighbors, so we didn't think anyone could hear the commotion. But while he was making the noise, we took the opportunity to book it into another room to get a phone. At one point, while we were on the phone with the police officers, they asked us if we could describe the man. Then all we knew was that he was tall and wearing black. So Kyle and I decided to be brave, so if something did happen to us that night, they would at least have a better description of who did it. We crawled back into the den and dared to look out of a small corner of the window. We gently moved the curtains out the way, and Lord behold, the man was still banging. He had moved the shutters off outside of the window, and they were basically hanging off their hinges at this point, rattling with the wind. We made direct eye contact with that deranged man. Direct, soul-searching eye contact. I don't think before this night I had ever believed that there is pure evil in this world. But when I looked into that man's eyes, I didn't see a soul. I know that sounds crazy, but those were not the eyes of a human. He was something unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Animalistic might be the word of choice, besides demonic. It was evil, unnatural, and something I never want to see again. When he saw us, he smiled, a twisted grin that I'm sure he thought was reassuring when he crouched down, so that he could get a better look at us. He then said, "Don't you want your mail? I can give it to you, if you only open the door." I remember grabbing onto Kyle's hand for dear life, and Kyle shook his head, and he threw the curtain back, and before we even had a chance to move any further, the man started violently banging on the window again. At this point, James had enough. He passed the phone to my sister and he yelled, "Leave us alone! The police are on their way and you're not getting in." After that, it seemed like the man panicked and the banging abruptly stopped. And when we heard rapid footsteps on the porch, and Kyle and I peeked out the window again, the man was running through the yard past all the trees and jumped the fence. The wooden 22-foot fence at the end of the yard, into the alley that separated the neighborhood from the old cemetery. We stayed on the phone with the police until they arrived, and our parents got there not long after. But the man was never caught, and we don't know what happened after that night. He just vanished into thin air. To this day, I'm 21 now. Whenever the doorbell rings when I'm not expecting a visitor, my heart drops. I break out into a cold sweat, and that's all thanks to the mystery package man. I would like to share with you a story that happened to my mother at the end of last year. We're from Catalonia in Spain. My mum is a doctor who works on a public hospital as a radiologist. She has no mental illness and is overall healthy, and the building is in good condition with no gas leaks or the like. She had a friend who went to her workplace to have some mammographs done. Everything goes as usual, and when they're done, my mum goes to an adjacent computer room where the images have been sent. She closes the door after her, and no more than 30 seconds later she hears the doorknob turn violently, as if someone was trying to enter the room. At first she thought it was her friend, so she called, "Come in." Note that the doors have lead protection to avoid ionizing radiation piercing through, but the knob kept turning. They were shaking it as well, so she yelled, "Come on in," and thought how rude it was for them to act like this. It was then she realized her friend could not be there, as she was putting her clothes back on, and there was no way she'd be ready. She explicitly told me she had the feeling there would be no one behind that door once she opened it. So that was it. She quickly opened it to see no one there. There have been a few other incidences around that room too. For example, one night there were two doctors with my mum, when suddenly one of her co-workers witnessed a bottle of gel flying at extreme speed against a wall. There was nobody there beside the three. They were all astonished. I know this sounds a bit cliché, maybe I'm not too experienced, but I can assure you she didn't make it up. One of her co-workers says there really is something wrong with that floor. No one really knows what. I've never actually told anyone about this, but when I was 11 and my siblings were in my room playing Halo, we had 2 controllers, so we're taking turns, and I was just watching my brother and sister play. My room had a bathroom connected to my sister's room that always paranoid me, so I left the door closed and locked. I noticed that the door was open and went to close it thinking my brother may have opened it. And then it was my turn, so I started playing. When I finished, I noticed that the door was open again. I told my brother very adamantly, "Keep this door closed, stop opening it." He and my 2 other siblings claimed they didn't open it. I closed it again and sat on my bed staring at it, seeing why it was opening. All of a sudden the door slams open and I see some cloudy shadow that looks like a person of about 5'8" move into the bathroom. I didn't say anything and just bolted out of the room into the living room. I refused to go back into the room for about 2 months and slept on the couch every night. As I said, I never told anyone about this, but I assume my mum sort of knew what had happened, because about a year ago my mum was telling me stuff she saw in the house and never mentioned it because she didn't want to scare us. My dad also had a similar experience in that house, like seeing someone lean over him when he woke up at night. That was the only experience I had there, and now I'm a bit of a skeptical on the paranormal and think perhaps it may have been my imagination, or maybe airdrafts opening the door, but I guess I'll never know. This happened when I was a toddler, and don't remember it myself, but my family has told me through the years, and something that happened to me a few nights ago made me think about it, and my mum filled me in on the details. My mum is a sensitive and can walk into a house and feel spirits, and sometimes tells you if they're evil or just lost. In my family we have a good amount of non-believers, but also plenty of family members who do believe. So growing up I've always just felt comfortable with all that. I've lived in haunted houses, spirits have visited me, and the specific story happened when I was 4 or 5. My parents were going through some marriage troubles. My father was getting abusive and lashing out, and obviously my mum was struggling with that. After 3 months of attitude and personality changes, things started happening to me. I would get bruises on my body, scratches on my back, some of them so bad they started bleeding, and I was changing. I'd have trouble sleeping, hated being alone, and I hated my room, and I kept telling people that the man was hurting me. Obviously, this led people to believe it was my father doing it. He had been hitting my mother, yelled at me and locked me in a closet. So, my mum kicked him out, leaving him to go stay with his own father while she tried to figure out what to do. This helped, or so it seemed. I started getting back to normal. I was happy and bubbly, but the bruises and scratches faded. And we were happy for about a month. During a normal bath time, my mother and I were playing with one of my dolls when she noticed something. There was a long scratch down my back. At first she wrote it off as kids playing around and scratching themselves. That had to be it, but they kept appearing. The bruises were coming back, and then I started talking about the man again. My mum said the way I described him was chilling, and she instantly believed me and contacted her uncle, who was a priest for prisons. The story I told my mum was that at night, after she put me to bed, someone would come out of my closet. Not just walk way out, a mist would come from under the closet door and a man would appear from that mist. This man wore what looked to be jeans and a white tank top, which my mum figures was a wife-beater of some sort, and would sit on my bed and talk to me. At first he was nice and play with my hair. He would tell me stories. His name was Bill. He used to be a cop, and he had lost his wife and family because he was bad to them. And then he started to change. He wanted me to go to the closet with him, and that scared me for whatever reason. Even that young, I knew something was wrong. Looking back at the time, my mum believes that it was when I started to be scared of my room and when I wanted to refuse to sleep in there. After I refused the man, he got worse and mean and started hurting me. which is when the bruises and scratches began to appear. He would try pulling me from the bed to the closet. He would throw things at me, but what got my mum is when I started describing what the man said he would do to me and my family if I didn't come with him. Understandably, my mum was very upset, and she called her Uncle Tucker, knowing what it had to be. Though she wasn't sure why she'd never felt him, and she felt she had failed me in some way. When Tucker arrived, he talked to me, wanting to know the story, which I shared with him. It piqued his interest because it was a chance that it was simply my imagination. They both felt that my story might have been swayed some, at least a few details. Once he was talking to me, he headed to my room, Bible and holy water in hand. They have both told me that when he walked into the room, instantly something dark washed over him and it worried him. So he started praying, talking to it, and finally blessed the room. And Tucker said he could guarantee that it was a demon, and it wanted my soul and possibly to take over my body. From what he could put together, from what was shown and told in the room along with my story, he believes that Bill was a cop, or at least would use that to make his victims more comfortable around him, which wasn't uncommon, and he was sure Bill had harmed his family, and that's why they left him. Tucker thought that the ghost slash spirit slash demon, whatever you want to call it, was hooked onto me not only because I was a child, which makes the connection easy, but because I was most likely sensitive like my mother, which Tucker had strongly believed since they found out she was pregnant. I won't go into details behind that because there's a lot of information. Back to the point. He warned her that it was probably going to keep happening and that I would deal with it my entire life, that I just needed to be strong and not to trust in every spirit I see. Luckily, after he blessed the house and prayed over me, Bill left, and I never dealt with him again. Thankfully, I was young enough that I don't have a memory of it. I've seen pictures of the scratches and bruises, but don't remember it. And while Bill might have left me, I've dealt with spirits my entire life, and I know I always will. I live in a middle to low class neighborhood in the Caribbean. It's a quiet place where nothing happens. The type of place people go to and retire, to sip pina coladas all day. However, a few houses next to mine lived a family that was not like the rest. They had the biggest house on the street and lived luxuriously. Their kids would play with me, especially the smallest girl we all nicknamed Tiny. Tiny was about 5 when I was 11, and she was always at my house. I knew my mom and the neighbors were concerned about a 5-year-old being outside all day and not arriving at her home until midnight on school days. But it was a quiet place where nothing happened, so no one got worried. When Tiny turned 6, her parents threw a giant birthday party for her, and all of the neighborhood kids were invited. I wanted to go. They had bouncy castles, water slides, and everything a kid would want to play with. But my parents didn't allow me to. I never knew why. I suppose it was my mum, as she didn't know her mum. I remember feeling very sad because everyone was there, and there I was alone, playing at home. After the birthday, things went back to normal, and one day we were all playing and talking about what our parents did for work. We asked Tiny and her siblings, but none of them knew what they did, except he traveled a lot and was always in meetings. I didn't pay much attention, and we all continued on with our day. One night we were playing on the street when we started hearing loud pops coming from Tiny's house. I'll never forget that day. The neighbors, including my mum, came out rushing us inside yelling it was gunshots. Some of us got into my house and we stayed there as the next door neighbor, a cop, ran towards Tiny's house. All we saw after the gunshots were a black van rushing down the street and almost killing a dog. Some men entered the house. Tiny and her siblings wanted to check what was going on, but everyone forbade them to go. All I remember was a bunch of cops and ambulances a few minutes later, and after that day, I never saw Tiny or her siblings again. For a few months the house sat empty. Black vans with strange men kept coming into the neighborhood door to door, asking for any information about the man and his children. No one in the neighborhood spoke about it. I knew the cops asked me about Tiny and the kids, and if they ever said something weird about her dad and mum, but I was only 11 and more concerned about playing Mario Kart on the Wii than what happened that night. Years passed and the story faded away. Now that I'm grown up, I asked my neighbor, the cop, what went down that night, as there were rumors the guy died. He said that night the man got a gun emptied into his skull, and his wife was gravely wounded but survived. Because he was a drug lord that was going to make a deal with the police to turn his rival gangs and some other people to the cops. The men in the van that were going door to door wanted to know where his kids and wife were, to also shut them up. As to his kids, his eldest son was found a few hours away in a neighboring town, his car set ablaze. He didn't survive. His other children are now living in other countries under witness protection programs. I just hope, wherever Tiny is, she's doing okay, and her family got the help they needed. I'm a 31-year-old male, Dutch but now residing in Uganda. This story happened when I was 13 years old. Before I start, there's important information that is crucial to understand what happened. I am Dutch, and I grew up in a town of about 60,000 people. I come from an upper middle class family and lived in a neighborhood that was built in the forest. The entire town is known to have a lot of nature. We lived in a big one-story house with 2 lavatories, 2 bathrooms, a garage, a big living room, 6 bedrooms and a nice garden all around the house. My parents were never people that thought a lot about safety. We had a huge sliding glass door connecting our garden, and our garden was easily accessible from all directions. Also, I can't remember, but I think the garage door would lead to either my brother's bedroom on the right side of the house or to the corridor that would lead to my sister's parents and my bedroom. This could be locked. My father's solution was to park his car in front of the garage door so that no one could get in. This house gave me the creeps ever since I can remember. My parents got a divorce when I was 8, and I lived with my mother, and I was finally able to leave my dad's house. The story I want to tell you happened when I was 14. I was playing soccer and actually got recruited for the youth academy of a team that played in the highest tier of Dutch soccer. This info is relevant later. We had a vacation impending at the time. Me and my best friend wanted to have a sleepover, and my dad had gone on vacation and his house was empty. So, as normal hormonal teenagers, we decided we wanted to spend a few nights in his house, watch movies, stay up late, play games on the PlayStation, typical things that 14-year-olds want to do. The day was perfectly normal, and as it became night, around 10 p.m, we start to hear upbeat music coming far from the distance. We decide to check it out. We leave my father's house and we follow the direction where the music is coming from, and it leads us out of the neighborhood onto a cycling lane with lots of bends that go through the forest. I used to take this way all the time to reach the soccer club, so I knew it by heart, as I did know the forest quite well. I told my friend that the music is most likely coming from the horse stables and that they probably have something like a teen disco, and that it might be fun to see if we can sneak into the party and have some fun. We continue on our way following the music, and Lord behold, the music did come from the horse stables. Now the only way I know to reach the horse stable was to go on the paved cycle lane and walk a kilometer on an unlit dirt path. The path was on both sides and covered by the forest, with the stables straight ahead of us. While we were making our way on the path and getting all psyched up by the idea of crashing a party, as we were a bit loud, on 2/3 of the way we hear a loud rustling coming from the left side of the forest. We are right on the side of the path, and this person emerges from it, completely dressed in black, with a long Matrix-style jacket and a black hat to go. We both brush it off as a man who was looking for his dog or something, but I'm a bit freaked out, and softly elbow my buddy and say, "Man, what the hell would he come out into a forest like this for at this time of night? Wonder what he's doing." He responds with, "It's probably nothing. Don't be so scared. We live in a town where nothing happens." His answer convinced me to continue. As we walked towards the stables, we walked towards the person, and he walks in our direction but stays on the other side of the path. The closer we got, the more my gut is telling me to get the hell out of here. I poke my buddy again. "Dude, I really don't like this. Call me a coward, but I'm getting really uncomfortable. Don't want to go to the stables anymore." I'm freaking out. And before he has time to respond, the guy is inches from us and yells, "Come back here." And he starts running after us. Oh crap. I see that my friend is slowing down to catch his breath, and I run to him and tell him to dive into the bushes and hide. While I run, hopefully he'll follow me. He hides in the bushes while I scream loudly and run for all I'm worth, looking behind me to see where the guy is, and he's still chasing me. I have no idea where I can hide from him. The bicycle lane is just straight for the next 500 meters or so, and I keep running. I finally reach the part of the lane where there are several short bends, and after I run the third, I see a small patch where I jump in and dive behind some bushes. I hear the guy running, and he passes me, with him shouting, "Wait, come here you little brats." I remain silent and in my hiding spot. I hear the footsteps going further away. I make my way back to where my friend hid from him, but without using the cycle lane. I reach the place and call his name, and he emerges from the bushes, and we decide to go back to my father's house, but take a big detour in a different direction to where the guy ran. Nothing happens while we're heading back. We reach the house safe and sound, quickly go inside and lock every door and window. We go into my dad's room, which is all the way at the back of the house, and turn on the TV. Still freaked out and super scared of what had just occurred. I still feel unsafe and uneasy. I close the curtains and slowly start to calm down. My friend stays quiet for a second, and we try to keep our minds busy with a movie. I wish the story just ended there. Until today, I'm not sure what happened next. Was it the same person or just a coincidence? But halfway through the movie, we both hear footsteps coming from the garage door, in the corridor heading into the living room. I quickly lock my father's bedroom door. I secure another window that leads to the bathroom straight into his room and lock the bathroom door also. I look at the last door. He has 3 doors that leads into his bedroom that lead into the back garden. I open the door and quickly slip out behind his room, grabbing 2 spades, and slip into my father's room, brandishing my 2 new weapons. For 30 minutes we heard footsteps in his house. I see a shadow in the living room from the gap in the curtains, but not well enough to make out who it was. And just like that it was gone. We didn't sleep that night. We were on high alert. As soon as daylight arrived, we left the house and headed to my mum's place and tell her the story. My dad calls me 2 weeks later. He returned from his vacation and he knows that I stayed a night with my friend. My mum told him the story, and he asks if I trust my friend, which I confirm. He proceeds to tell me his hard drive from his computer was stolen while he was on vacation. Not his brand new TV, not my brother's TV or PlayStation, and not a whole computer. Nothing looked like anything was wrong until we tried turning on the computer and nothing was there. Someone broke into his house specifically to steal his hard drive. I don't know if it was the man chasing us in the forest. The more I think about it, the more it would not make sense. He came from the forest in the opposite direction where we were coming from, so he didn't follow us, I think? Why chase us so obviously if he wanted to steal something so specific? But the chances of those 2 things happening in the same night is also highly unlikely. This didn't happen to me, but has been relayed to me from my late grandfather, who was one of the most honest men I have ever met. He was the kind of guy whose word meant law. When he said something, that was it. It wasn't ever a lie. In any case, here is his story. My grandfather was born in 1931 in a poor and rural part of the US. From a young age, he helped his parents on the farm, as I'm sure many other kids at that era were forced to do. Towards the end of the farm, the land sort of went down a small hill, at which point it wasn't very harvested by my family. And bordering the bottom of the hill was a deep and dark forest. There'd be times my grandpa would tell me when he was about 10 or 11, when he'd get to the edge at the top of the hill and look down towards the forest. There'd be times where he would see a dark shape, a shadow, staring at him with glowing green eyes. He always thought it was his imagination, and after telling his mum one day, she told him that it was one of the forest sprites and to ignore it, and if he ignored it, it would leave him alone. He took her advice and tried to ignore it. He didn't see it frequently, but when he did, he really tried to pretend it didn't exist, because it frightened him deeply. Something so wrong. He said its aura, its presence, felt dark. That's the best way he could describe it. A continued oppressive feeling that bore down on him. Weeks at a time went by, and he wouldn't see the figure frequently. About 2 years later, once again, finishing up at the end of the field, did he dare to glance down, admiring the sunset, when he saw the twinkle of green eyes and a dark, shadowy blob move behind the trees. He didn't even bother looking. He just bolted home. And that same night, as he was going to bed and turning out the light, did he look out and see something in the distance? The glowing eyes. They were no longer in the forest, which wasn't visible from his house. Instead, it was by some nearby trees in the distance. He got spooked. He jumped straight into bed without drawing the curtains and pulled the covers up to his eyes. There he lay, looking intently at the darkness under his sheets. He tried falling asleep, but the fear was all-consuming. When it got to a point, he told himself he must be imagining it. Did he pull down the covers ever so slightly, just to get that sweet reassurance that there was nothing in there with him? He pulled the covers back, and there was nothing in the room. He chanced to look at the window. He was going to make a run for it and close the curtains quickly, but just as he was about to close them, did he notice that the pair of green eyes were now dangerously close to the window. As they closed, he ran back into bed in absolute darkness and fell asleep, shaking. At some point in the night, he awoke needing to use the bathroom. He remembers slipping off his bed, taking a few steps, and hearing a creak. This wasn't the distinct creak of the floor. This was the creak of his closet door. He thought it was strange, but assumed it was either a cat or a dog, as they had several that lived on the farm, and he walked to the toilet. Upon returning from doing his business and getting back to bed, did he hear the creak once more. He was tired, but still afraid from the events of earlier. He was still trying to convince himself that it never happened and was all in his imagination. And with the tinge of bravery still lingering inside him, did he sit up properly and squint towards the dark corner of the room where the sound had came from. It was the closet. He thought maybe he'd best check to make sure nothing strange was going on. So he got out of bed again, pulled the door to the closet back, which was slightly ajar, and in the bottom, near his shoes, were those green eyes. He said he can't remember anything that happened after that, other than the dark mass, this blob with the green eyes rising higher than his clothes, and suddenly he passed out. He woke up in the morning at the foot of his closet on his wooden floor, in pain a little bit, his mother asking if he was all right. He had no recollection of the night before until later that day, when it all came back to him. He never saw the green-eyed thing again, but it scared the living daylights out of him, and for a long time he refused to go anywhere near that forest. His sisters all enjoyed going down to that forest to play with their friends, but he would always stay clear of it. The house and property were eventually sold off when he was a young adult, and he's never been back, and has refused to tell me where it was located, in case the creature, whatever it may be, still remains. I catered at a family reunion for 200 people. I knew from the very start there was going to be problems because no one wanted to pay the remainder of the bill. 50% deposit to hold the date was already received and cashed, but no one had a plan on how to pay the remainder. So I told them that I wasn't putting the food out until I received payment. About an hour and a half passed and I had collected most of the remaining cash. About $3,000, and someone wrote a check for a couple of $100 to cover the rest, which bounced and took 4 months to recover. Once the food goes out, everyone seems happy, except the event space owners, who were super shady from the beginning. We are actually at the second location that they own because the first wasn't available. Classic bait and switch. Anyway, the venue owner tells me that the space is booked for a second event that starts in half hour. Personally, I don't care because I got paid and just wanted to gather my equipment and leave. I come to find out the second group is a college fraternity that had gotten kicked off campus for violence, so they throw their parties elsewhere. I told my team to leave. Don't clean up, don't help me pack up, just leave now. The frat boys are already starting with their family group reunion, and no one is remotely close to prepared to leave the family reunion. I grab all my equipment after hiding the cash in my truck and take off without saying a word. By the time I got home about 35 minutes later, there's a shooting in the local news. 2 dead, 4 in critical condition from the venue that I just left. I've never seen shadow people from my peripheral vision. They're always a few feet away from me, but right in front of my field of vision. I've only ever seen them at night, when my room is quite dark. Generally something rouses me in my sleep. I'll open my eyes, and there it is, a dark, humanoid figure, which I always initially assume is a family member out of bed, and trying to awake me for some reason. I'll then ask them what they're doing, or why they awoke me. But when they say nothing and remain still, I'll grow annoyed and continue repeating my questions until they just gradually dissolve before my very eyes. This is the moment where the fear sinks in, and I realize this clearly wasn't the family member I thought I was just aggressively speaking to. My point here is that these dark humanoid figures are already present, so I don't see how they materialize in the first place. As I lay beneath my covers, I kept my eyes on the corner of my room at the foot of my bed. As I stared into the patch of darkness and shadow where the 2 walls met, I felt like my eyes were playing tricks on me, because it looked as if the shadow was undulating. I kept my eyes fixed to the space, and slowly but surely the shadow grew larger and morphed into this big, dark, round humanoid figure. I say rounded because it was kind of like a featureless, heavy-set Santa body, made out of super dark shadow. I'd never seen anything like this before. He was wearing a hat. He had a kind of large sombrero and just stood there motionless once manifested, and seemed to be made completely from shadow, as though the thing just pulls in and sucks in a patch of deep shadow from a space in the room and uses that to form his space. It was a really trippy experience, and I was a kid and quite scared and remained stock still, staring in shock for at least 20 seconds, trying to gain the courage to scream out to my parents in the next room. I still remember counting to 3 in my head before I finally had the guts to scream, "Mom!" I closed my eyes while screaming, so this time I wasn't able to watch the thing depart or dissolve. My parents took mere seconds to enter my room, and once they were there, my eyes opened, and I looked straight back into the corner and the thing was gone. I never saw one like that again. The others are always quite skinny. One thing for sure though, each time I've had an encounter with a shadow person, even though I've now had quite a few, I'm always equally and unsuspecting at the time before, and I always feel the same initial frustration while not receiving a response, right up until that cold fear takes over upon their eerie and unexplainable departure. When I was a senior at Purdue University, my great-uncle Hank was in a serious car accident and hospitalized. My dad and I were very close to Uncle Hank. He was my confirmation sponsor when I was a kid, and acted like another grandpa to me as a kid, and was by far my dad's favorite uncle. So we were very concerned to hear this news. When the doctor spoke to the family, he unfortunately did not have a good prognosis. He didn't expect Uncle Hank to live longer than a few weeks. After he was hospitalized, several of Uncle Hank's kids came back to Indianapolis in order to be with him before he passed. One night a week or so after the accident, my father received a phone call from someone at the hospital, informing my dad that Uncle Hank had passed. My dad thanked them, and immediately called his cousins that he knew were at the hospital that night. Here was where the story gets strange. My dad's cousin answered the phone, obviously shaken and crying, but incredibly confused as to how my dad knew that Uncle Hank had passed. He told my dad that Uncle Hank passed less than a minute before my dad called, and that the doctors and nurses were still in the hospital room, turning off all the machines and speaking to the family. There was no one outside of the doctors and nurses and family in that room that knew of his passing, let alone someone who could call my dad so soon after it had happened. My dad's cousin checked with the nurses station, and no one there had called my dad, and they didn't have his phone number on file. We really have no explanation as to who or what called my dad that night to inform him of Uncle Hank's passing. When I was 16, I had just gotten my first car, and had it about 3 weeks. This guy walks up to me at a gas station and asks to use my phone. Naive and trying to be nice, I let him use it, but he walks away for a minute and then walks back out with an older guy. I didn't know at the time, but he had taken my SIM card out my phone. Then, they get into the back seat of my car. A friend of mine was in the front, and he asks if I will give them a ride up the street. At this point I was kind of nervous and just wanted them gone, so I thought this would get rid of them. It was literally like a minute drive to this bar, so I figured okay, let me just do what they want and hopefully they'll be gone. They were kind of intimidating, especially to 16-year-old me. But as I started to drive, he says, "Take this right, go down this road," which happened to be on the road I live on. So I thought, cool, I'll drop him off and go home. Well, I get to the house he wanted to go to, but then the other guy, who looked a bit scary looking, gets into my car again, and they say, "Take us to Wendy's and bring us back." It was about 5 minutes away, so I figured I would get these guys their Wendy's and that would be it. So I take them through the drive-thru, get food and start to head back to my house. But he says, "No, take us up the street." At this point I tell them, "Is this it? I need to be getting home." And he's like, yeah, just drop us off. It's like 5 minutes away." I still haven't got my phone back, and I was too scared to ask at this point. And that's the least of my worries, really. I drive and get to this dirt road, really freaking out now. We come to an area surrounded by trees, kind of a big circle and big enough to turn around, so I start to turn around because there are no houses. At this point he reaches up from the back seat and throws my car into park and grabs me. My friend jumps out and tries to run, but one of the other guys sees him and hits him, but got away. It was dark and hard to see. He then pulls out a firearm and tells me to get out. I'm really scared, thinking that I'm about to lose my life. He hits me in the mouth with the gun and tells me to give him everything. I had some money in my pockets that I hand to him. Then they all get into the car and drive off. I'm miles away from anywhere and start walking. No phone, freaking out. I called out my friend's name and didn't hear anything. I walked a few miles to a gas station and cops are there. I guess my friend made it there and called, and I called my dad and told him what happened. It was the scariest moment of my life, and I should be dead. My face was all busted up when we got to the police station. We tell them everything. They think we were buying drugs from these guys and are trying to get me to tell them who it was. Then they pull out a book of pictures. After half hour I see one of them who hits me. I knew it was him and instantly told them. A few weeks later I heard that he had stolen another car, got pulled over, ends up stealing a cop's car and is chased down. He gets out and tries to cut across a train track with a train coming and falls, and it severed his leg. Justice was served, I guess, but it doesn't end there. Years later I saw him at a bar on crutches, hobbling around, and I was satisfied. Then a few years later he got hit by a car one night, and that was it. I know this is hard to believe, and whether anyone believes me or not, I don't care. It's very true, and I've always felt I should be dead. But I'm not, and he is. So to the guy who almost ended my life, I know we won't meet again. I had a strange feeling today that left me paranoid, even now as I'm working my typical graveyard shift. Well, it wasn't just a feeling. I wish it was. But unfortunately, it is not the case. I'm home alone, working on a painting when I hear my floorboards creak. Now, my floors are very creaky, and I'm average height and weight, with a fair share of ass-kicking instances. So initially, I was not alarmed. I lived with two other people, Andy and Teddy. Both had gone out earlier. I didn't remember hearing Teddy's car pull in. It's a big-ass white truck, and it's very hard to miss due to the gravel in the driveway. Even if I had missed it, Andy typically likes to come in yelling or singing obnoxiously, so obviously I was like, what the hell? I wait for a while and hear nothing, so continue painting. Then I get this incredibly horrid feeling of dread, so much so that every muscle in my body tenses, and then the creaking happens again. And me being a classic dummy, put my paintbrush down, open the door to my room, and walk out to see nothing. So I venture out into the kitchen, and the feeling grows stronger, to the point where I feel the need to protect myself. So I dash over to pick up a small knife I remembered Andy had left on the kitchen table earlier. I walk further down the hall, first into the bathroom, where again I see nothing, and then into Andy's room. This is where the feeling grows even worse. I grip the knife as hard as I can behind my pack and peek into the closet. His closet is the type with the double doors that slide open. One of the doors is already pushed open and I can feel something crouching in the darkness behind the closed side. I can feel something watching me. I continue to stare, my breath caught in my throat. Then something changes. and it feels as if whatever is in there is now making direct eye contact. It stares at me so much that I stumble back out the room. I quickly check Teddy's room, see nothing, and just as quickly note the hell back to my room. Shaking, I shut the door and put whatever songs I was listening to its highest volume, and the feeling just disappears. As if a hood was pulled over my head, everything just feels incredibly normal. Whether I'm going crazy or not is debatable. I wouldn't doubt it though. Definitely some weird stuff that I don't appreciate. My name is Gigi, and I was 14 at the time. This happened about 4 years ago. That day, my little brother Noah was sick and had already spent 3 days in bed. He had a high fever, no big deal. The only real trouble was that he was 6 and obviously got our entire attention for that week. So yeah, that day my parents went out to buy his medicine and left me alone to take care of him. They also asked me to bring all of my brother's toys inside so they wouldn't get wet from the rain that was coming later that day. So I did as I was asked. I took care of Noah and I brought some of the toys that were laying outside. I was pretty tired that day, and I thought that I could do the rest later. So I went inside and sat down on the couch to watch TV before I had to prepare for my brother's lunch. I was zapping through the channels and wasn't really aware of what was going on around me. About 10 minutes later, I heard 3 honking noises coming from the street and didn't really pay any attention to it. It could have been the neighbors or a car passing by. Then I realized how late it was and that I had to go to the kitchen and start making my brother's lunch. Noah was resting upstairs, so I was in the kitchen cooking his meal. The thing is, my kitchen has a large window offering a view on the street, and I saw my neighbor a bit worried out of his car looking around. Once again, I didn't pay any attention to it and was focused on the food. At a moment, I opened the fridge and had a weird feeling like someone was there staring at me. I closed the fridge door and looked at the window, and there was a person standing outside close to the window looking in. Now I don't know why, but I can't for the life of me remember what that guy looked like. There's a stranger standing outside staring at me and I wanted to scream for help, but I just couldn't. I felt like the only thing that I was going to do was take my brother and leave the house via the back door. I know it's a bit excessive, but I was 14 and imagined the guy would break the window at any moment to come in. So on my way to Noah's room, I noticed the guy following me very calmly through the window. Imagine my surprise when I found the front door a little open. I'm certain I didn't close it correctly when I brought his toys back in, and because of that, I now have the habit to check at least 3 times if I lock the door for sure. When I saw the door, I understood, and eventually got a few seconds to go upstairs instead of closing it because he was close enough to get in before I reached it. So instead I ran upstairs, rushed into my brother's room and closed his bedroom door. Noah was very weak and kind of upset because of the noise I made downstairs. It could seem unimportant, but hearing him complain made me realize we couldn't leave anymore, and while I was thinking I heard someone coming up the stairs and literally crapped myself. In a desperate move I opened the window, and fortunately underneath it stood Noah's big-ass trampoline, the one with a net around it. The only thing reasonable for me was to throw my brother onto it and jump, hoping we wouldn't break our bones. Luckily, the first floor was only 4 meters high. When we landed on the trampoline, I could hear the bedroom door open. Now, Noah says while getting off he saw a face, apparently of someone with a beard, white eyebrows and a hoodie, and a great psycho smile. I didn't, but I believe him. We got off and started running the streets. While I was running, I heard a voice behind us screaming, "Gigi?" I turned around and was relieved to see it was one of our neighbors, the one observing the street prior, that was waving at us to come inside their house. I was very happy to go into their house, as we used to go over and play with their kids all the time. He closed the door and we waited in there for our parents to return. We were there with his wife and kids while he was waiting out there. Funny thing he explained later is that he saw everything. He honked at the stalker because he was standing in the middle of the street looking at the house, and he also saw the guy walk into the house and a girl throwing her brother through the window. It was very funny when he told it back to us. So my parents came back and were ironically planning a good little evening, and they brought pizzas and a movie along with the medicine. So imagine how stupid they looked when they saw police cars and us waiting with them. We explained everything and later moved elsewhere. We were already looking for a new place anyway, but that really gave us the motivation to search really hard. We don't know what happened, but when the cops came in, the back door was open and there was no one inside, so obviously he bolted. As I said, I still think about it sometimes, and there's no way I will ever know who that guy was. I also realized if I had done what I was asked and brought the trampoline back in the garage as I was supposed to, well, I wouldn't be here to tell you this story. The only thing I regret is that now Noah is 10, we got rid of his old toys, as well as the trampoline, which means we can't make that jump thing if it happens again. So to the creepy stalker, let's not meet. "20 years ago, I was sleeping beside my husband and I woke up. As I was turning over, I look over at my husband's shoulder and saw a woman standing in the bedroom doorway staring at my husband intently with curiosity. She then began moving towards him. She had no idea I was watching her. When she began walking towards him, I got angry and I was going to launch myself over him and tackle her, but she was too far away. I was concerned I would wake my husband and he would get up suddenly, causing me to hurt him. Instead, I turned over, got out of bed and went around, but by the time I got to the end of the bed, she was gone. This was no common intruder. She was approximately 5 feet tall, very slim, but with a definite female figure, around 100 pounds. She was not clothed, but looked like a solid silhouette, or as if head to toe in a skin-tight black bodysuit. She did not have hair on her silhouette. Why can I describe her so well? She was less than 12 feet away from me, and this was not the first time seeing the paranormal, so no shock or fear. But although I did not mind paranormal encounters, I do not let them come near my husband. Can anyone give any hints as to what she was? She seemed solid. I could not see through her or any details in the hall. She was darker than the surrounding night, but it might have been the moonlight, and we have skylights in the living room downstairs. When she realized I saw her, she stopped and felt surprised. I have also found info on shadow men, but this is a woman, not a shadow, and not sinister. Does anyone know what this could possibly have been? My mum was in training to become a nurse while she was pregnant with me, and one of the places she worked on was an old psychiatric hospital, since abandoned. One night while pregnant, she was on the late shift, with an early shift the following morning, and it was snowing. So my dad insisted she stayed in the nurses' quarters, which is a separate building from the hospital, rather than risk the drive home. Not happy with the idea, but understanding the reasons, she stayed and didn't sleep the entire night. A nurse had previously ended her life in the nurses' quarters, and there was nobody else staying there, so she was ever so slightly terrified. She said she heard whispers, saw shadows, and was generally a wreck by the time she had to go back to work in the morning. Side note, I like to joke that the ghosts there are the reason I have so many spooky experiences, and why when I go home the activity there is amplified, saying that they attach themselves to me and follow her home, and stayed with me after birth. This usually ends up with my mum being freaked out. Also, a friend from home was experienced working in the local hospital administration block. Their office had a connecting wall with the morgue, and on multiple occasions while the morgue was known to be empty, sounds were heard through the walls, like things moving, people walking, and something scratching on the walls. I live with my parents in a really small village in Europe. Our house is quite big and directly attached to my grandparents' house, which is basically a big house cut into two. And the house next to theirs are my aunt and uncle's house. So yeah, we all live really close together and often pay each other random visits. On top of that, my grandparents' front door is always open during the day, so me and my cousins can come in whenever we want. Since it's a small village, we know basically everyone, and we're not too scared to leave the door open. People always have to walk across the whole garden to reach the front door, so it's quite safe and hidden. So now one day I was home alone because my parents were working and I didn't have any classes. My grandpa, uncle, auntie and cousin were also working, so it was just us two. My grandma was chilling in her kitchen, which is a little square room in the corner of the living room, which is a bigger square room. So when you walk from the kitchen to the entrance of the house, there's a part of the living room that you don't see. Suddenly my grandma heard the front door open and close. My family and I usually yell greetings when we enter so we know they're here. But she heard the door and nothing else, so of course she stands up and calls out for my dad, and then my uncle. But nobody answered. She starts walking to the entrance to see if maybe she left the door wide open or something. But as she walked away from the kitchen, she hears a creak behind her. Now remember the part of the living room I talked about? The one you can't see when you're walking away from the kitchen? Yeah. Well, there you find a huge Narnia-style wardrobe. When my grandma turns around, she sees the wardrobe door wobbling a bit, like if it wasn't completely closed. She gets closer to realize someone's hiding in it. She starts yelling at the stranger, asking him to get out. He does and stands awkwardly for a few seconds. My grandma is this small little lady, and the guy was way taller than her. She didn't really know what to do at this point. She asked him what he was doing here, and after hesitating a bit, he said he thought this was a restaurant and got confused. Lol. My grandma told me that he kept looking around the room, and it looked like he was trying to find a weapon. For some reason, my grandma walked towards him while asking him to leave, probably trying to intimidate him, and he began running to the front door, pushing my grandma since she was in his way, but thankfully she didn't get too hurt while falling. She then closed the door, called me to tell me to do the same, and waited for my dad and grandpa to come home. When they did, they called the cops and made sure that no one else had been hiding in the house. The cops told us a few cases like this had been reported in the village around us. For most of them, the guy just came in, since a lot of the people in this village left their doors open and stole stuff. But apparently, an old lady in a similar situation lost her life from probably the same guy. So the cops told us that my grandma calling for two men when she heard the door open probably saved her life, because the guy thought there was someone else in the house. New Year's Eve in Moscow. I was a dark-haired, dark-skinned man and was drinking with my significant other, who's a blonde woman. We're in a bar getting friendly with some locals who try their best to speak English, so friendly that one of us gave us a matryoshka doll that he was going to give to his mother later that night. They seemed a little too friendly, and maybe they just were that. But at one point I went to order more drinks and the bartender who'd been watching and serving us gave me a stern look and said, "You should leave now." I found this a little strange and unexpected, so naturally tried to question what he meant, but his face was drop dead serious. He looked at the friendly group, then at my girlfriend and then to me and repeated the words. I didn't really want to take any chances in Russia and wanted to see another bar anyway, so I grabbed my girl, the doll, and promptly left. Apparently, they had marked us to be taken. The steps, apparently, of what I've heard, are befriend tipsy foreign tourists, give them a distinct brightly coloured object to hold onto, and wait for them to become increasingly drunk. Make up an excuse to go outside either for a smoke or to go another bar, and watch as your crew waiting outside see the marked object, put bags over your new friend's head, and push them into the waiting car. I'm very lucky, unbelievably lucky, that the bartender wasn't in on it. He recognized the doll straight away. In my hometown in South Texas, there's a hospital that is abandoned. It has an extremely demonic presence. I have 2 friends who have gone inside and ventured down to the basement level. There, they have heard growling and seen glowing red eyes. That was 8 or 9 years ago. My little brother, who is 17, has had friends go into the basement there and encountered the same thing, including the stairs that leave the basement to be in a completely different spot than when they entered. At night, if you get close, it feels like your heart is being clenched tightly. It's hard to catch your breath, as if something is sucking the air out of your lungs. The feeling of despair and panic just engulfs you. You just feel the need to get away from there as soon as possible, and that's just coming into the parking lot around 8 p.m. I haven't ventured inside, but the feeling I described are what I have felt along with my wife. The presence is intense and extremely powerful. My wife also claims to have seen some stuff. This story took place roughly 30 years ago. Me and my best friend Emma were rebellious teens. We were both 15 and hated going to school. It just wasn't our scene. At the time, we lived fairly close to each other and would often hang out at each other's houses. We'd sometimes even skip going to school and explore the local woods so that no adults could see us. It was on these excursions that we found the house of an old lady. Her name was Mrs. Bateman. We never got to meet her, but we saw her and said hello. That's about the extent of our conversation. Her house was in the middle of the woods, decrepit, practically falling to pieces, and she seemed absolutely insane, talking to herself while sitting in the garden on a chair that was surrounded by forest. It was an extremely odd place for a house, and we assumed that it must be because she owned the land, and were worried that we were potentially trespassing. But at 15, you'd think you're above the law and everything else. Well, one day, we hear, through some mutual friends, neighbors and stuff, that the lady, the crazy lady specifically, that lived in the woods had passed away. The very next day, we're talking about it at school. And seeing as I really didn't want to do geography, me and Emma decide to head up into the woods to see if we can see the house, maybe even the dead lady. Obviously, she'd been removed by this time, but we were teenagers and quite oblivious to how the world works. We started setting off. It was around 2 p.m. because we were skipping our final lesson. As we were walking through the forest, we knew no one would be none the wiser. This is where Emma started to pipe up, saying she had a bad feeling about doing this. My only intention, of course, was to look at the house from the outside. I never really had any intention of going in, and just to see if I could see the body. There was this morbid fascination surrounding me. I wanted to know what happened to this woman and why she suddenly passed. What made people say she was crazy? And how did they know she was dead? I convinced Emma to carry on going, despite her relentless protests. It took us about 20 minutes of walking when we finally reached the house. There was no one there, which surprised me at first. As we approached the door, we looked through the windows, cautiously, scared that she might jump out at any moment despite people saying that she'd passed. There was no one in sight. That's when I got the guts to try the door. I slowly lowered my hand to the handle and started pulling down. At that very moment, it opened, and I had a satisfying grin cover my face. Emma was scared. She dared not venture into someone's house without permission, but I did. I told her that we'd be quick. We'd just be exploring. No one was home, and the lady had passed away anyway. As far as we knew, she didn't have anyone to leave the house to or anything, so we were doing everyone a public service by seeing if there was anything worth taking. I know, it was pretty crappy of me. Spoilers, I never actually took anything. In truth, I was just trying to entice Emma to go in, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, continuing with the story. She followed me in because I wasn't going to stay outside, and looking up at the sky, it looked like it was going to rain. So, I guess all of the reasons meant that she was going to come in. The house, as I mentioned before, wasn't in a very good state. She was a hoarder. There were newspapers piled up all around the place. The electricity was still working, but it was a dingy little place. We looked around the kitchen, and it smelled disgusting. Clearly, she hadn't washed dishes in a long time. There was food waste accumulated on plates and stuff that was going mouldy. She'd only been dead a few days, I thought. How could all of this have accumulated so quickly? In any case, we carried on looking around. The house didn't have a very welcoming atmosphere, but I just assumed I felt uncomfortable being on someone else's property when deep down I knew I really shouldn't be. We went up the stairs. The rooms were bare and barren, except her room, which had a whole host of trinkets on the little sideboard and table. Then we saw the last door at the end of the upstairs hallway. We tried to open it, but there was a small catch above us that appeared to have a lock. At that moment, Emma recalled that there was a tiny key which seemed to fit the lock over on the dresser in the other room. She went over, fetched it, and like a charm it worked. We opened the door and were instantly hit with a wave of cold. We wondered if this was because this part of the house was in disrepair, but regardless, we took up the wooded stairs and started making our ascent. It's important to note that her house was carpeted, but these stairs were wooden, which gave it an extra creepy feel. There was no light switch as we were going up, so we were going up in full darkness nearly. By the time we reached the top, we tried using our hands to see if we could find any form of switch, when finally we found one, an old-fashioned one. We flipped it, and we were greeted by the darkness of the loft. There wasn't really much about. A few picture frames covered by a sheet, an old chair, nothing really of interest nor value. It was interesting to be up here. Having been in lofts before, I knew that you had to be careful, as there were lots of beams and wooden planks, and stepping in the wrong place could mean you fall through the ceiling, as it's not that stable. After we had a good look around, we were just about to leave when my friend Emma shrieked and ran downstairs. I asked her what was wrong, but she didn't reply. I looked around the loft room and didn't see anything, and just as I was about to flip the switch and make my way down, did I look directly into one of the corners of the house, near an area I hadn't really been paying attention to. There was a figure, a shadow. It almost looked like a man, just standing in the corner, slightly crouched. All I could make out was the shape, no features. I stared at it. I blinked, and it was still there. At that point, I just about crapped my knickers and decided to run down the stairs, leaving the light switch on out of pure fear. Emma had already made it down the second set of stairs and was just about to leave the house, screaming at me to run out. I bolted, left the house, and we fled and went home. We were chilling at our house for a while, talking about what had gone on, hoping that my brother wouldn't overhear, as he had been at school, and we really didn't want him to know that we hadn't been there. After saying in whispers how freaked out we were, we both asked each other what we'd seen, and when we concurred it was the same shadow man, did our excitement fade to fear. We really hoped we hadn't disturbed something, and that's when we realized we never even closed the door. It was about 6 p.m. at this point, and fairly dark. The forest and house weren't too far, but we really didn't want to go back. A part of me was worried someone may have seen us leaving that house, or that we might get in trouble. Now, the teenage stupidity had all but dissolved, and was left the real possibility that we could get in trouble for our stupidity. We knew we had to go back. No one closed the door. I even left the light on upstairs. What if people saw? What if people knew it was us? We gathered up our courage and a torch and started making our way back in the dark. The streetlights guided us most of the way, and that's when we got to the entrance of the forest. We walked in with our torch to guide us. It wasn't the best, visibility was limited, but we made it to the house with the torchlight. When we arrived though, the door was closed, but the light was still on upstairs and was leaking through and could be seen from one of the top windows. Emma said she didn't want to go in, but went in anyway, as I knew it was my responsibility. She had the decency to wait at the bottom of the stairs and said that if she heard me shout she was going to run, and she'd meet me in the forest as she had the torch. I flipped on the light switches and started making my way up the stairs, hoping to hell I didn't see anything. My eyes were darting around the house, absolutely terrified, scared that at any moment this shadow man would appear out of nowhere and do who knows what to me. Every step was painful, and when I made it to the upstairs landing I took a sigh of relief as there was nothing. That's when I saw the door. The door was closed. The upstairs door, I mean, the one that would take us to the loft. I had most certainly left it open, but perhaps in my haste, it had bounced back or something. Although it was open the whole time, I tried not to think about it, and I didn't want to make any noise, so I took off my shoes and started slowly creeping up the stairs. However, one of the wooden steps betrayed me, and it made a loud creak. I just about had a panic attack there and then, hoping that the entity wouldn't hear me. I was going up step by step. I could see the light switch. I was just about to flick it, and then I did. A wave of relief washed over me as I crept down a little louder now, content that I had done what I needed to do. I slipped on my shoes and started making my way downstairs. But when I got to the bottom, Emma was no longer there. Oh no, I thought. Where did she go? The door was closed and I never heard it open. Me being as quiet as possible, I doubt she would have left. So instead of opening the door, I looked out of the little square window in the door, but there was no light around. I walked out of where the stairway was and into the living room to see Emma stood stock still and terrified, staring into the kitchen area. I instantly saw what was scaring her. There was the shadow. It was now a lot more pronounced than before. The light leaking in from where we were was meeting the darkness of the kitchen, but it was very clearly visible. It was radiating a dark and fearful aura. Maybe this is why the old woman went insane, I thought. And with that, I grabbed her hand, closed the door on our way out, and ran like I've never ran before. I don't think in all my life I've run any faster. This was Usain Bolt proud speed. We made it back to my house, sweating, panting, crying, and hugging at the end. We were so relieved and vowed not to get up to any mischief again regarding people's property we shouldn't be in the first place. That's our story. We never saw the Shadow Man again, or even approached that house. We stayed out of the woods for a long time. In a way, I think this experience helped us, as we were too scared to even venture out of school, and ended up passing all our grades reasonably well. But we both never forgot. Even though as we grew older our friendship drifted apart. In my 50s I actually moved back to the area, and she had never left. A few years ago we were talking at a bar, and this event came up. We spoke of our memories and how terrifying it was, and both could relate exactly the same thing to each other. I knew it was never just a story. It really happened. But God, it was the scariest moment of my life, and really made me believe that there's something else out there. I had recently moved into my own place. I was 19, and this was because my ex-stepdad was constantly being emotionally abusive towards me and my mum. I'm a female. I moved into a council estate in the northeast of England. Before moving into the house, I was warned it was a rough area. I was given the weekend to think over whether I wanted to move here. Over that weekend, I visited the house at random times throughout the day to see what the activity in the area was like. I decided it didn't seem too bad, as I was moving there to have a place to live and not make friends. I lived there for about a year and never had anyone bother me really, apart from one night. Let me describe the layout of this house a little bit. It was a 2-bedroom house with a back garden, with the gate to get to the back garden being on the right of the front door, which I always kept padlocked. My bedroom was above the front door with a window facing the front door and side gate. I also had a drive, which my car was parked on. I had recently started working day shifts as opposed to nights, so my sleeping was pretty messed up at the time, and I would fall asleep pretty early on in the night. On this particular night, I was in bed at 9 p.m. and started watching a show on Netflix and fell asleep pretty quickly. Around 11:30, I was awoken to a loud banging. I stayed in bed and hoped it would just be a one-time thing, but then the banging proceeded and I could hear shouting. I can't remember what was being said as I was pretty freaked out. Living by myself and no reason for anyone to be knocking at my door. Then, while someone proceeded to bang on the front door, loud enough to sound like they could have broken it down, another of the party started to shake on the side gate, which fortunately was padlocked. I then rang my mum, who was on night shift at the time, and answered quickly. I was crying, and quickly filled her in on what was going on. She stayed on the phone with me throughout the rest of the ordeal. I don't know how or why, but I got the courage to peek outside from behind the curtains and could see 2 blokes, probably in their late 20s to early 30s. They looked like chaps, dressed in tracksuits, and don't look very friendly. At this point, I'm pretty sure they're heavily intoxicated, with either booze, drugs, or both. After this is carrying on for about 20 minutes, I realize they're not going to stop unless I said something. So me being brave and perhaps a little stupid, I opened my bedroom window. I shouted down to them, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Now I can't remember the names they said, maybe Steve. The one who had been banging on the door said, "Get Steve out of here now." Me being confused because obviously I lived by myself, and I said, "Who's Steve?" Then the guy replied, "I know he's there, his car's there." Bear in mind at the time I was a 19-year-old with a Toyota Corolla with a private reg. For obvious reasons I won't share the reg, but to put it simply, the plate is an abbreviation of my name, so obviously this Steve guy wasn't going to have my car with a girl's name on his plates. I replied to this guy and was like, "No, that's my car." He then proceeds to ask my name. Stupidly, I gave him my first name, but not my last. And then he asked, "Who lives here then?" I stupidly reply, "Just me." But thankfully after this remark, his friends, who had been trying to get inside my side gate, were like, "It's time to go." I watched as they walked down the street away from my house, until they were out of sight. To make sure they weren't going to come back, I rang the police and made a statement in case they did return. Thankfully that was the first and last time I saw them. Me being forgetful sometimes, I would forget to lock my doors. Thankfully that night, I had locked my front door because if I hadn't, I have no idea what would have happened. So to the creepy, intoxicated men, let's not meet again. I live in a flat that only has 3 floors and doesn't have a lift. So if you live in the 3rd floor, you have to walk all the way up the stairs. This situation happened at midday while I was chilling at home and my mum was picking up my sister from school. So that meant that I had to let in the man who stops by every Thursday selling water containers. The thing is, he's supposed to deliver the water containers by 2 p.m. This time was the one that my mother told me specifically he should be there, otherwise no one's home. But on this day he arrived at midday. He rings the doorbell and I tell him on the intercom we need 2 containers and go downstairs. Once you go downstairs, there's a really long hallway until you get to the front door of a building. I greet him. "Well, hello there," he says, kind of amused. I make some small talk, give him the money, to which he tells me not to worry, because he'll take the containers upstairs. I tell him I can handle it, but he keeps insisting. While we're going upstairs, he starts asking me questions like how old I am, why I wasn't at school, and the like. Red flags immediately go off. I answered that I was about to go to work, and I definitely don't go to school. I felt so uncomfortable and vulnerable, it was horrible. He placed the containers at the front of my door, and I told him, "Well, let me walk you back down the stairs." And his answer still annoyed me. "Oh, I wouldn't mind being stuck here with you." Are you kidding me? As if that wasn't creepy enough, he then asked me where my mum was. "She's inside helping my dad," I lied. This man could be my dad, and he was hitting on a woman he thought was a schoolgirl. It really couldn't get more disgusting. That walk on the long hallway was the slowest I've ever had. I couldn't wait for him to leave the building. I was shocked, mad, and felt dirty. I don't know why. I said bye, and he had the nerve to kind of hug me, and I shut the door on his face and ran up to my flat to try and feel safe, but I didn't. I was turning on the shower tap when my doorbell rang not once but 5 times. And not the one downstairs, the one upstairs. So to sum up, I locked myself in the bathroom until my mum came home, and I blurted out what happened. You know what the worst thing is? Besides the way the creepy man behaved, it's that my mum told me I was overreacting. I was so angry and disappointed that I didn't talk to her until I came home late that night. I told her to be extra careful if my 12-year-old sister finds herself in this situation, to not open the door to this man under any circumstances, and after that, she told me I was right. A middle-aged man with good intentions wouldn't assume you go to school, ask you where your parents are, and tell you that he would like to be stuck in the building with you. He still comes every Thursday at midday, despite my mum telling him there's no one at home. The hospital I used to work at was extremely haunted. The 6th floor had been disused for a long time. It was the top floor, and no one ever went up there. There were times when I'd be using the elevator, when I'd look on the little panel above the doors to see where it was at. And there would be times it would be on the 6th floor. As far as I was aware, only the janitors had the keys to that floor, as well as the night security staff. There would be absolutely no reason anyone should ever be up there. But more often than not, when I saw it, I'd feel a chill run up my spine. I can't remember what it was used for, as I haven't worked there for some years. Anyway, at one point in time, I was working the night shift. It was extremely late, around 4 a.m., and I was fairly tired already. It was a very slow night, and I had spent some time chatting with some of the other nurses. I get paged to go to a different floor, so I make my leave and head to the elevator. As the doors chime, I step in and look around me. There's no one in the elevator, so I jump on and descend 2 floors. But instead of opening on the 5th floor where I needed to get off, it kept on going. Now, in order to reach the 6th floor, you have to have a special key on the elevator itself in order for it to even take you up there. So at this point I was getting freaked out. It reached the 6th floor and the doors dinged. They opened, and I looked around. I was on the fabled 6th floor. I knew I'd only be a few minutes late, but I couldn't risk having a look around. I was so fascinated with why this top floor had been abandoned. I looked around. There were some papers still at the nurse's station. Doors were open. A thin layer of dust actually covered a lot of it. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I wondered if any security members ever actually came up here, or if they had any reason to. I started walking around when I heard what sounded like a chair, one of those chairs on wheels, move ever so slightly, like it was pushed. I turned to look in the direction of the sound, to see said chair move from just behind a desk. I gave a shudder, and at that point I'd had enough spooks, and I turned around and pressed the button at the elevator. The elevator was on floor 1 apparently, so I had to wait a little while. I turned around, pushing the button frantically, but there was nothing going on. I looked and saw the numbers start to ascend, 2, 3, and that's when it happened. I heard the chair. It sounded like it was pushed with a lot of force. I looked behind me, and sure enough, the chair is rolling towards me at high speed. I tried to move out of the way, and it slammed into the doors with a loud thud. I looked and shouted, demanding to know who it was. At this point, I was convinced a member of the security team must have come up, not locked the elevator, summoned it up, and then were trying to prank me. I knew the guy who was on shift, Bradley, so I shouted out to him, "Hey Bradley, if you're messing around with me, you know I'm going to tell the supervisor." So I started walking up, no longer feeling scared but brave, convinced Bradley was there joking around with me. There weren't many places to hide. Most of the doors were propped open with door stoppers. I looked around. It was pretty freaky, but I simply couldn't see him. Where could he have concealed himself? I knew it must have been him. So I started making my way back to the elevator. It was stuck on the 4th floor. Who knows what was going on? I waited and waited, and it still didn't come. And then I thought I'd call Bradley on his phone. I'd hear the ringer, or at least the vibration, find out where he is, and beat him at his own game. So I pulled out my phone and started to ring him. It rung, but even though I heard quite attentively, I still couldn't hear him. After about 30 seconds of ringing, which is a substantial amount of time, the door chimed and I went into the elevator. I pressed the 5th floor and started going down. I made it down to my floor and Bradley didn't pick up, so I thought nothing of it and knew that I'd beaten him at his own game. Maybe he thought the same thing I did and put it on silent. I got to work, and at about 6 a.m. I get a phone call from Bradley. I ask him if he's finally man enough to admit that I caught on to his little game, feeling so smug with myself. However, his words sent a chill down my spine. "Bro, I only just woke up. What are you talking about? No one goes up to the 6th floor. I don't even think I've been there myself other than in the training day." At that point, a chill certainly went right through my body. Was he telling the truth? I asked my supervisor who was on night shift today, and she tells me it's some other guy, Edgar. I go up and call him and ask him why the elevator took me to the top floor. What was going on? He says he didn't have an explanation for it, but that if we wanted we can check the security footage and try and find what the hell was going on. So we do. When we look at it, the chair was pushed by an invisible force and hit the elevator door. That was all visible. He was always downstairs in his little cubicle. He never once came up or unlocked the lift. One of the freakiest things that happened to me. I spoke with a number of co-workers about it. Some of them believed me, some of them didn't. and a few of them even said they had their own experiences. Janet's was by far the creepiest. She explained in her story that this had happened to her once. She was heading up, and that the elevator stopped on the top floor. In curiosity, she took a peep around, but as she was waiting for the doors to go down again, did she hear some footsteps coming from behind her. She turned around, expecting to see the person who'd gone up there before that had unlocked the door, trying to apologize, she said, because she knew she wasn't supposed to be up there. But there was no one there. She was looking directly at nothing, but the footsteps were still approaching. She was getting extremely scared. As the footsteps drew ever closer, she started to shudder. She turned around and started hammering at the button of the elevator, but it wasn't coming up any faster. And when they finally were right behind her, they evaporated into nothing. She says that was one of the scariest moments of her life. My other colleague told me a similar story, but this one was by far the creepiest. Again, elevator. Goes in. Punches for the 3rd floor. It doesn't stop at the 3rd floor, so she punches for the 5th to try and get off, but it doesn't work. The top floor was her final destination. The doors open and she looks around. The lights are off. The place has been disused and abandoned for a long time. She gets off the elevator because she wants to have a peep around, just to see what's on this floor. She was a little nervous and worried that she wouldn't be able to get back down, but she knew deep down that if she really wanted to call someone, she could get maintenance to come and get her down. No worries. She started looking around the floor, interested in seeing what had happened here. As she made her way through, she started to feel an unearthly chill overtake her. She then very clearly heard a child's laugh at the very end of the long hallway. She squinted, wondering if it was perhaps a child playing in the hospital with the elevator and somehow managed to get up here. She started running, telling them to stop and that they needed to come back down. She swears she saw a blur run from one room to another. At this point she was angry. They had just directly disobeyed her, and they were in a hospital, for God's sake, on a floor they shouldn't be on. She was very concerned, and upon getting to the room she looked around. There was a desk, a cupboard, and not much else. She looked under the desk, and in the cupboard there was nothing there. It was completely empty. No person, no anything. She told herself she must have just been seeing and hearing things. It was quite dark and creepy after all. But you see, there's street lighting all around the hospital, which gave a nice orange glow on the inside, so it was still fairly well lit, by all accounts. She started to make her way back to the elevator, frightened, but trying to tell herself she didn't actually see anything. Upon pressing the button, did she hear a faint whisper in her ear. "I'm right here." She turned around and screamed, but there was no one there. She just about wet herself. She kept hammering on the door and pressing the button, but the elevator wasn't coming up any faster. She was sweating, in hysterics, and just waiting for the moment that the doors would open and free her from this torment. This being up there was making her nervous. When the doors finally opened, she jumped in, and just as they were closing, she looked out, and for a split second, she thought she saw another shadow dart from one room to another. That was enough for her. She didn't actually tell anyone the story. The supervisor asked why she was late, and she said that she was just in the restroom and apologized, even though she looked very shaken up. It's only when I shared my experience that people started to share their own. They say that sometimes the elevator will take people up to the top floor, but most of the time people dare not leave its doors and go down the elevator again to not bother whatever spooks reside up there. I wonder if the reason they disused that part of the hospital is because of the creepy apparition. I guess I'll never know. One of my best friends and I met back when we were 10 in the 4th grade, 2009. A common theme in our friendship was horror. We both loved and got off immediately watching and playing scary video games together. At the time, it was Secure, Contain, Protect on his laptop. Fast forward until the summer of senior year in high school. We drive up to this area of New Jersey called Hope Township. Real desolate farmland area, very few people out there. There's an area of road called Shades of Death that we've looked into for years that we're sure we'd eventually go to. So we drive up one time, just me and him. It's about an hour's drive from where we are in New Jersey. I remember it was rainy and extremely misty, this one chilly July night. We get there about 9 p.m. We're rolling down this long 10-mile desolate road when we spot a car going at 15 miles an hour in front of us. Keep in mind, these are rural New Jersey roads, with 40 miles an hour being the speed limit, and high beams are acceptable. We start going at their pace to match them, and I keep telling him how weird this is as we're driving. He looks at his phone for a few minutes, saying they're probably just some old people, but then we see a kid around our age turn his head from the back seat and stare at us absolutely fixated. My eyes have been glued to the road, so I decide to point this out to my friend. I also realized the car was packed with teenagers, with 3 other heads turning to stare at our car. My friend then says he feels bad about this, as another car is suddenly right behind us, also matching our speed. I get it was off, but I really didn't think just about how dangerous the situation could have been, until the next day after we both went home, after my boy crashed at my house. I eventually pass the car in front of us and speed up to lose sight of them and peel off into a desolate rundown parking lot and turn off my lights so they wouldn't see where we'd gone. We both wait for them to pass and agree it's strange. When we went back up the road to go explore the state reserve, Jenny Jump State Forest, which is another story entirely. The next day we hear on the news that MS-13 gang members brutally ended the life of innocent people in the area walking through the forest with hatchets. To this day we still reflect on how badly the situation could have gone, and we are honestly curious to return. And we have. So to those kids on Shades of Death Road, whoever you are, let's not meet. When my husband's father passed away back in 2012, we inherited so many antiques and family heirlooms from him. One of which is this giant old wooden wardrobe, about 8 feet tall and 5 feet wide, which was made by my husband's great-great-grandfather. Since it was so huge, we didn't really have room for it in our house and kept it in our garage. We call it the Narnia closet. Before my son was born, I used to go into the garage to smoke weed every night. I'd be sitting out there, and without fail, at some point, I'd get that strange feeling of the hair rising on the back of my neck. I'd look over at the Narnia closet, and the door would slowly start to swing open. It creeped me out so badly that I always would go to close it, then run back inside. It literally would happen every time I'd go there by myself. We have a pool table that kind of is a man cave set up in a garage, so our friends would frequently be hanging out with us, smoking and drinking. Not once did the wardrobe door open when I was with other people. I later asked my husband and my sister-in-law if they had ever witnessed the door coming open by itself, and they looked at me like I was crazy and said they had never seen that happen before. I checked the latch so many times and it was actually really sturdy, not like it could just pop open at any given time. One afternoon I was out smoking and like clockwork the door slowly creaked open. At this point I had enough and was scared. I lost it a bit and screamed something like, "You need to stop opening the Narnia door. You're freaking me out. Please never do it again." And guess what? Since I said that about 4 years ago, I have never seen the wardrobe open by itself again. This event occurred on the 29th of October, 2019, between 6:23 and 6:27 a.m., Eastern Time Zone of the USA. My daughter, who was nearly 4 at the time, had woken me up that Tuesday morning right before Halloween. I felt awake and perky that morning, so I grabbed my black glasses and put them on my face, got out of bed, then stood facing the wall which the door is located on, to slip my feet into the purple woolen slippers as I do each morning. This morning, however, was different. I had an extremely difficult time getting my slippers on, no matter how I moved my feet. The slippers moved millimeter by millimeter, and my feet chased them, unable to slip inside. It would have been comical how much trouble I was having, or it would have been had it not been slightly irritating and frustrating. However, determined, I continued to slowly chase my slippers with my feet as I checked the time. The clock was by the door, and it illuminated that it was 6:24 a.m. Meanwhile, I watched my daughter bound towards the door, and despite my protests, she threw it open. Peering out into the dark hallway, I noticed something pure black, much darker than anything else, and began processing what this could possibly be. My dad had placed several items, a small bookcase and a lamp, as well as other stuff, outside the bedroom door on the wall opposite my bedroom door and the bathroom door to the left of my room. So I assumed the blackness was some sort of office equipment. Yet I continued staring, and an uncomfortable feeling began rising in my chest and stomach as I made out the shape of a nose on a head, and I was viewing this at an angle rather than head on. My slippers were still not cooperating either, as I had the sudden thought, oh God, is that a shadow person? I chided myself, rolled my eyes and laughed internally, thinking I've been watching too many paranormal shows on the Travel Channel, or perhaps too much Mortis media. But at that moment my discomfort and sense of alarm grew, as I noticed that my daughter had not moved once she threw the door open. My eyes widened as I wondered, does she see it too? Looking back and forth between the blackness and my daughter, I suddenly realized that it could lift its arm and touch her. Frantically, I tried to get my feet into the slippers, but it was as if my foot and the slippers were opposing poles of a magnet. I literally could not get my foot inside, for some reason that I can't explain either. I had it in my head that I had to get my slippers on before moving to the other side of the room, so I continued to struggle with my stupid slippers, watching the darkness and my daughter stare at each other. Great parenting, I know, but I think the shadow person had a hand in it. By now, the time was 6:26. Suddenly, an idea popped into my head. I called my daughter over. "Baby, come here, please." And for once she obeyed, as the spell was broken. My slippers suddenly allowed my feet into them, and let me tell you, I had felt incredibly clumsy being able to put on a pair of slippers. By the time my daughter had walked the mere 3 meters to my side, I gave her a hug and looked up, and she nonchalantly said, "I saw a shadow." It felt as if all my internal organs dropped to the floor. Gasping, I stared at the door. The blackness was gone. It was 6:27 a.m. Where the blackness had been, there was just a lump with a white lampshade and a desk or bookshelf in a blonde shade of wood. Nothing could have possibly had the appearance of a jet black silhouette. Fast forward to yesterday, Thursday, May 14th, around 4 p.m. I walked down the same hallway, but when I stepped in front of the bathroom door, which was closed, did I see the light pop on and hear the fan start, as they're on a single motion sensor switch. Again, the door was closed, so it would be impossible for it to pick up any movement outside the bathroom. Just to be sure, I knocked, opened the door and peered inside. It was completely empty. Now this one I could have rationalized away, except the timing seemed so deliberate, as it was only about a meter from where my daughter and I had seen the shadow person more than 6 months before. A shiver ran up my spine as the memory came back to me. Every time I had to walk past that spot, since seeing the shadow person, I've been afraid, and I think the bathroom light was a bit of a reminder that he is still there. My visit to Yorktown Memorial Hospital. We had heard this place was haunted, and that you can get creepy things happen to you if you are being a dick to the paranormal. I've always been able to feel things, and I have that eerie sixth sense some people joke about having. The day we went was Halloween 2018. It was about a 2-hour drive away, and supposed to be fun. I went with one of my best friends at the time, and my husband, both of which are huge skeptics. Right off the bat, when we get into the parking lot, the alarms in my head are screaming at me to not go in there. There's something in there that's bad, and of course, like the idiot I am, I go in. We get inside and are surrounded by candles on the desk, and are greeted by the caretakers and tour guides. We are told we can only use our phone lights and take photos, and begin our tour. The hospital had so many open doorways, but they had these cage walls to keep people from climbing over and taking things from inside. There was so much graffiti on the walls and holes in the ceiling and cracks. We come up to a room full of old dolls and a rocking chair, and I feel a creep on my forearm. The caretaker and guide tell us about a small child who will play with guests if they take her ball and roll it down the hallway, and if you take a doll from her room, she is not thrilled with you and might even scratch you. Of course, we couldn't expect a normal night on Halloween in a haunted location, because once we started moving on, the tour began to storm. We started following the guide to the next hallway, and they continued telling us about all the amazing artifacts in the hospital still intact, like the metal bed that was just the slab that so many have passed away on. Once we enter the kitchen, I immediately feel a difference in energy, like something was following us. The guide then asked us if anyone gets the burning sensation to speak up, because the other night when they did a lockdown investigation, one of the girls in the team with tattoos got burn marks out of nowhere. I didn't think much of it until we started walking down the hall where another patient, JT, passed waiting for someone to help him, because his friends had abandoned him on the doorway. I could feel cold on my hands and arms. When we went upstairs, we went to see the chapel, and I felt so lightheaded standing and staring into the broken room. Down the hallway from the chapel, I could smell sulfur and rotting eggs. The smell was so bad I had to cover my nose. When we walked further down the hallway, we passed a room, and a huge waft of soap hit my nose, and I felt a hard tug on my backpack. On this section of the tour, no one was behind me, and my group had gone ahead, as if it felt like I was being held back. I walked towards the front of the hallway and get an urge to look down the hallway, the one that no one was supposed to be in. That's when I saw a tall, dark, skinny figure, like a man with one hand bent out like he was waving, and a bright white light in the other, like a phone but brighter. I started calling my husband's name because I thought it was him. He had a tendency to wander off, and he came out of the stairwell that everyone else was on, and I couldn't believe it. I saw an actual dark figure with yellow eyes. One of the guys came up to me and asked if I was alright because I couldn't believe it. Was this the smell, and was this the tug? Or am I just crazy? When we finally got downstairs, I told my husband and the best friend in the car that I saw something, and both said that they felt cold gusts of wind and thought it was the storm. After that tour, I had night terrors for almost a month. I would wake up crying and shaking because I could see the figure in my room, but whenever I'd be able to actually get up, it was gone. This happened when I was around 12 years old. It was in the middle of the night at my house. My dad would work the graveyard shift. Since it was the weekend, I had stayed up most of the night. It was somewhere between midnight and 1 a.m, and my dad had told me to lock the door and go to sleep, which I did. I went to my room and finally passed out, but only for about an hour. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of knocking on my back door. It scared me awake. After taking a few moments to process what I heard, I decided it was probably just my dad knocking on the door. Maybe he just forgot something, maybe being really exhausted. I knew he had a house key, so I just told myself he was more than capable to unlock the door. But the knocking persisted. It was pretty creepy. Then the next thing I knew, the knocking stopped, and then it started again, but at a different location. Someone was knocking on the window in my kitchen. I continued to assure myself it was my dad. I didn't understand why he couldn't just unlock the door himself. He always had a key on him, and I felt pretty freaked out, so I wasn't answering the door. If anything, my dad would call me to open the door on my phone, which was right next to me. The knocking started again at another window. I was terrified now, too scared to get up and check who was out there. But the knocking wasn't stopping, and the next thing I know, the knocking moved to my front door at a harsher level too. That's when it hit me that I couldn't move. I was frozen in fear. I couldn't scream or talk or move a muscle. My heart was dropping at the knocking, and it moved to another window closer and closer to my bedroom, to the point where my curtains could see through. I still couldn't move. I didn't know what to do or say. I could only stay out as my fear consumed me. I moved my eyes over to the window and my heart stopped when I saw a man peering through. A tall man with a dark ski mask. I could hardly make out the details because it was so dark, but I think his mask had some sort of skeleton design on it. He tilted his head slightly. I tried to scream, but nothing came out of me. I closed my eyes hard and started yelling, telling myself it isn't real, over and over. I opened my eyes and there was no one there. I sighed in relief until I heard a loud whisper tell me, "I'll cut you." Everything suddenly stopped. I couldn't move again. I really couldn't sleep anymore that night either. It didn't feel like a dream. I've never experienced sleep paralysis before, and everything was so real. I don't know what happened, but I pray that I'll never have to experience it again. It was one of the most frightening moments of my life that I've ever dealt with. I was home alone that day, so no one could back me up. But the following morning I asked my dad when he came back from work if he came back earlier that day and knocked on my doors and windows. He confirmed that he did not. A few years ago, my family moved into the house that we currently live in now. The first night I stayed in my room, I was having a difficult time going to sleep, as I couldn't shake this weird feeling that had come over me. I'd been trying to sleep with my back to the closet, and decided to get up and get water. But when I turned around, I became very aware of a face staring straight at me from the inside of my closet. The face looked as if it was a mask made of glossy white porcelain, where the eyes and mouth should have been, but there was nothing but empty holes. Somehow it was darker than the entire room, even without any eyes. I could tell this thing was looking right at me and filled me with a fear and unease, unlike anything I've ever felt in my life until now. I jumped out of bed and managed to turn the lights on, but as I tried to run out of the room in the hallway, I found that I couldn't leave, and even though I could move freely in the room and the door was open, it was as though something was blocking the exit. As a last resort, I tried to call for my parents and my brother who were asleep downstairs, but couldn't muster any sound. It seemed as if the wind had been knocked out of me whenever I tried. I ended up hiding underneath the covers of my bed to get through the night, and for the next few days I still felt as though something was there in my room, until the feeling went away suddenly. I discovered a few weeks later that my grandmother had secretly prayed over the room after hearing that I had told my mother the day after this experience. Surprisingly, I think this may have had an effect on whatever was there. I've not seen the figure in my room since then, Nor have I had another experience like that, though I have caught glimpses of it in the room across the hall, and even once while in a corn maze in October a few years back. I was wondering if anyone has ever experienced anything akin to this. This happened a little over 2 years ago, and I still think about it from time to time. It was October, and I was a senior in high school at the time, and had been sleeping in very late, as I had a terrible case of senioritis. When I woke up, my mother had just returned home, and I said my typical morning greeting to her in the kitchen. She had seemed somewhat surprised when she saw me, and eventually told me something rather alarming. About 30 minutes before I had awoken, she had seen my younger brother getting ready for school. As she had passed by the archway into the living room, she said she saw me standing next to the couch. She assumed I was waking up and groggy. She hadn't thought much of it, and continued on her task of taking my brother to school. The rather alarming part is that not only had I still been sound asleep in my room, but she told me that I had been wearing a grey t-shirt with a specific design on it. At the time, I no longer owned that specific grey t-shirt. I'm not even sure where it went. I was also wearing a completely different t-shirt when I woke up. She said that I had just been standing there with my long dark hair obscuring my face. This chilled me to the bone, as one can only imagine. I got over it pretty quickly though, in the dismissive way a high school senior often does, but I still think about it from time to time. My parents' house has always been rather creepy. I had a few more odd experiences up until I moved out and into an apartment with my fiancé, then boyfriend. On a few occasions I've heard my name being called by my father when I was home alone. A pretty creepy encounter happened a few months after my mum had seen my imposter. I had been putting my shoes on in the dining area as I looked up, and I saw a greyish figure float by the window. It had gone by the first window and didn't continue into view of the second window. It completely vanished. It was broad daylight, as I had gotten a pretty good view of it, even though it had gone by rather fast. It seemed to be wearing a cloak, or a cloak-like grey hoodie. I remember grabbing my bag and running outside, heading down and leaving for school like a bat out of hell. My mother had also reported seeing orbs of light shooting across the ceiling on occasion, and hearing the occasional voice or two call her name, one of them being a child's voice. My parents' dog will sometimes whine at a specific wall in the living room before backing up and running down the hallway like he's terrified. This is alarming because he's a big 100-pound dog. Even my fiancé has experienced a few things. The creepiest by far being the sight of the same possible shadow person I had seen. This was right after I graduated. We'd been cuddling on my bed. I had my face against his chest and my back to the bedroom door. All of a sudden he stiffened and said, "Whoa." He said he saw something zip by the open doorway. It was almost as tall as the door, dark in color, and seemed to be gliding. It also looked to be wearing a cloak of some kind. This is just an estimate, but the door is 7 to 8 feet tall. When he told me this, I immediately thought of the dark, seemingly cloaked figure that I had seen a few months before that. He had also been scratched once by seemingly nothing. Something of these experiences are rather run-of-the-mill haunted house stuff. Others stand out and are more unnerving. The only people who haven't felt, seen, or heard anything odd are my father and brother. This has come to my mind once again, because a few weeks ago my parents had gone out of town, and I had stopped by to bring in their mail and borrow their vacuum, as mine had broken. As I walked through the house to grab the vacuum, a very sudden feeling of uneasiness fell over me. I felt the overwhelming feeling that something was nearby and watching me. I'm not gonna lie, I grabbed that vacuum and booked it out of there. I hardly wanted to lock the place up. Here's the thing, I've always been interested in the paranormal, but this all stumps me. I sometimes wonder if some of the events may have been caused by me. I had played with a Ouija board a few times with a friend when I was 15. There is also an abandoned house about a mile from my parents' home. Keep in mind this is in the middle of the country, long dirt roads and cornfields going nowhere. We'd walked there multiple times and taken pictures on the inside, with broken mirrors, pentagrams drawn on the walls, broken beer bottles, and totally unfinished walls and everything. We even found a child's shoe on this side of the house, and the skulls of some animals in the barn. We were creeped out. On one occasion, my friend, Ali, had turned and yelled, "Bye, ghosts, we love you." Stupid, right? This messed up part is immediately after that. We heard a loud scream from the property of the house. It sounded almost like an animal. Needless to say, we didn't return after that experience. Weirdly enough, any time I opened my Photos app to show other people the pictures we took, the app would crash and my phone would sometimes even die at full battery. Never had an issue with that phone. Afterwards, there were a few times Ali would stay the night and I'd be pinched seemingly out of nowhere and she'd feel her hair be pulled. This stopped after a month or so. Bad choices aside, I've researched all of this as much as I can and feel maybe it's time to get an outsider's opinion. I'm sharing this in the hope that someone might be able to get answers in regard to these odd happenings. More specifically, the ghost who stole my face and the mysterious cloaked shadow person. I'm also wondering why only myself, my mother and my fiancé have experienced these things. Perhaps we're more perceptive. My brother and father are skeptical. They don't buy into the paranormal at all. My fiancé is very skeptical too, and yet he's experienced these things and has never found an answer for them. He's experienced a few other rather messed up paranormal things in his childhood that he can't explain, but that's a story for another day. The creepiest thing I found suggested his scratches, the 3 long superficial slashes down his back. They could have been of demonic origin, which terrifies me. If anyone has any ideas, please let me know. I could really use with some help. I work in a residential treatment center for teens and kids. I experienced some weird things when I worked overnight there. I now work days, and there was one room in particular that the kids always dislike. So when I worked overnight, one girl moved into the room for another room, and always states she couldn't sleep in her new room because she felt like she was being watched. Months after she discharged, we had another girl move into the room. This room is different than the others, and the bathroom sinks in the room and makes a visual barrier between the main section and the sink area. She had moved a comfy chair over by the sink instead of by her window. When I asked her why she wanted it way over there, she said she feels like someone sits there and watches her at night. Now, just recently I had a third resident who was not here when these 2 girls were here and say that she doesn't like her room. We have 6 rooms on the unit, and this one is the 4th room she's been in. The other night I took her to the kitchen for some positivity time, and she admitted she didn't want to go to bed. I inquired as to why, and she says she has a hard time sleeping in there because she feels watched. She says she's been closing her shades at night, but it hasn't helped. She's never felt this way in any of the other rooms. The room is also next to our family room, where at night, a clock flew off the wall and landed several feet away. When I lived in England, I was a regular, and then DJ at a goth club, running at a functioning church in Greater Manchester. The caretaker and artist in residence was a kind guy who loved industrial music, pink mohawks and fire breathing. How the vicar decided to allow a goth night once a month in his church is a story I never heard, but it's still going strong and is much beloved. One packed night as we drank white wine straight from the bottle, my husband came running in from outside the church, "Call 911, he shouted over whatever Covenant or NVM Nation song was pumping at the time. My husband, James, is a calm and collected person, in direct opposite to me, more aggressive and forthright personality. But this night he looked panicked and frightened. "What's happening?" I asked. "Some people are being attacked." I started to rush towards the front door, as I knew a lot of my friends were outside smoking, but James held me back. "No." To find some quiet, I hid in the ladies' restroom and dialed 999. The call did not go well. "Hi, we need police. My friends are being attacked outside a church." "Where are you?" "Just outside Manchester, at Sacred Grace." "There's no Sacred Grace in Manchester." "Okay, it's just off Deansgate." "There's no Sacred Grace off Deansgate." I shouted into the crowd for the cross streets, and the 911 dispatcher was impatient. "Deansgate and Piccadilly in Salford," someone called back. I relayed that to the dispatcher, who sighed and said, "We'll send someone over," before she hung up. While I was on the phone, people rushed in and barricaded themselves inside. At some point the music was cut, and all 100 of us tried to be as quiet as possible. James told me he was outside with our friends, smoking, when he felt a fist go past his head. Another friend was punched in the back, and the other smokers all rushed inside and closed the door behind them. None of us knew what to do. There were people outside who just randomly jumped a bunch of us outside a church. What the hell? It wasn't before long we heard shouting and crunching, low male voices uttering insults, and we weren't sure what the crunching was. Eventually there was silence and someone opened the door. We thought everyone had got inside, but we were wrong. One of the organizers, Jason, laid on the ground with pools of blood around him. An ambulance had arrived and there were 2 paramedics. One had an oxygen tank in hand and shouted at the bystander, who lit back up. At this point it's a blur as to what happened after we watched Jason being carted away to a Manchester hospital. We were all shaken up and scared. From other scraps I heard the men who were outside said that they wanted to mess up some freaks, in their words. I refused to let a bunch of scallies scare me away from a night I'd really grown to love, so we showed up the next month and the next, until the horrible night where Jason was beaten so badly his jaw had to be wired shut was just a story. In my regular life, I've always looked average. I'm tallish with blonde hair and blue eyes. I had weirdly coloured hair once when I was a teenager, and I dyed it bright green, manic panic. But as much as I loved my goth nights and horror, I also had a day job. I worked as an IT person in a nice building in a nice part of Manchester, and I had to blend in. At the weekends, I wore too much vinyl and high spiked boots with too much makeup, and during the week I wore Zara slacks and sweaters and no makeup at all. The church wasn't just used for goth nights and weekly services, it also hosted other events. The artist in residence, Dave, put together, like art shows, and because we were regulars, we frequently were roped into helping out, serving drinks and clean up and provide soundtrack. One night, Dave and others in the congregation were exhibiting various paintings and sculptures and mixed media pieces. James and I were summoned to pull prints and pour wine for the attendees. It's actually thanks to this night I know how to pour a pint, with not a lot of head. I wore a black work dress, slacks and a pink top. My hair was blown out, and makeup was subtle. James wore jeans and a nice shirt. We had to look nice-ish because the mayor of Salford was going to be there. Art night closed, the mayor and her office assistant left. We cleaned up and I went outside with my pink mohawk. Dave and my husband were outside smoking, and we stood and made small talk until a man approached us. My heart pounded with fear, but I wasn't initially sure why. He didn't look like anything. He was probably 6 foot bald and wearing a t-shirt, jeans and sneakers. He was holding a bag soaked with grease from the chippy around the corner, and I was afraid of him. I wanted to run, but was sure that we would have somehow been worse than just pretending like things were still normal. "What's going on here then?" He nodded at the door. I exchanged glances with James. "Just a night thing for the church," James said. "Oh yeah? None of them freaks nights again?" That's it, I thought to myself. He's the one. I hadn't seen any of the men that attacked my friends, but I knew in my soul this was one of them. I hoped that my business casual bartender outfit meant he wouldn't connect us. A freak night? No, just an art night the church put on. I keep my voice steady and tried to keep my cigarette from shaking in my hand. Dave had been silent and said, "I should go talk to the vicar." He emphasized vicar. He probably hoped it would keep this thug calm. We nodded and stood in front of the door after it closed to hopefully prevent our visitor from following Dave. The man grinned at us. "Did you hear what happened? A bunch of people got messed up here a while back." I flicked my cigarette onto the street. "Oh yeah? That sounds awful." His smile broadened, showing gaps where his teeth should have been. "I heard they got a right kicking." My husband had cracked the door, and I stepped back towards the gap. James moved with me to go inside. Neither of us wanted to turn our back on him. Everything about this man seemed dangerous, and we felt things escalate. We may have blended in, but it seemed like reliving what he'd done was making him want to do it again. "Oh, and I was there," he bellowed, the last part, his knuckles white on his takeaway bag, his other hand clenched. Rage lit up, and his eyes and body were tense. In one quick motion, we both went back inside. The huge and thankfully heavy wooden door closed behind us, and the man pounded his fists on them until he grew tired. Thankfully, he was too stupid, not interested enough or too hungry to wait for us to go home. I don't know if the police ever investigated what happened, but Jason never returned after having his jaw wide shut. The night petered out a little bit just after this, but it's still growing strong now many years later. As far as I know, nothing like that ever happened again, and the man with the chips didn't ever return during any of the other events we volunteered at, or otherwise attended. This happened to me when I was 5 or 6 years old in my old house. At the time, the house only had 2 rooms, so me and my brother shared a room while my mum and stepdad slept in the other. My brother was at a sleepover this night, and my best friend Kylie slept over. She slept on my brother's top bunk. At around 3 a.m. I woke up. Kylie was still asleep, and I was facing towards my wall. I turned over to my other side and looked at my closet door, and I clearly remember how scared I was when I stared straight at a tall shadow-like man on my closet. Of course, the first thing I thought of was Slender Man, and I still kind of believe it looked a bit like him. I got up nervously and looked out my window, which was directly across from my closet, to see if there was something outside casting a shadow. Lo and behold, nothing. I ran back to my bed, hid under my covers, and fell asleep. The next morning I told my friend all about it, and she believed me. Of course, I saw this again last year. Me and Kylie had a sleepover at her house, and we were pulling an all-nighter. At about midnight, her parents were asleep, and we snuck downstairs, grabbed a box of Cheez-Its and Triscuits, and I went out of the living room to grab a bag of Smart Food that we left in the living room before we went up at 10. When I grabbed the crisps, I saw something from the corner of my eye. Of course, it was the same thing that I had seen years ago. I dragged Kylie out of the kitchen and showed her. At that point, we just went upstairs and binge-watched Big Mouth. My family has always been pretty sensitive to the paranormal, only on my mother's side, but it did pass down to my brother and myself. The first story occurred when I was about 6 years old. I have a friend called Caitlin. We hung out almost every day. I live in a wooded area, and we have a brush pile of approximately 7 feet. Caitlin came over one day in the middle of winter, and we were sledding down the snowbanks in my driveway. We were about to go on our 3rd or 4th run to solidify the track, and Caitlin froze in her step. I jokingly asked her if she was tired already, and she smacked me and pointed to the brush pile. "Do you see that?" she asked me. I turned and saw a figure there. It stood a foot or so above the brush pile, making this thing about 8 feet tall. It was in the shape of a person, but a solid black mass. Needless to say, we both freaked out because it was just standing there, and as we ran towards the house, it disappeared. Fast forward 8 years, I'd just turned 14 and we temporarily moved in with my grandparents. I was down in the basement doing some artwork for an assignment, and I felt like I was being watched. I turned around and I remember dropping my paint palette on the ground. There it was. This thing that I hadn't seen in so long was standing in front of me. I had no idea where it came from, and at this point had chalked the previous experience up to being a child with an overactive imagination. But here it was, standing in front of my face. I noped out of the basement as fast as I could and started seeing it more frequently every time I went to do the cat litter, which sadly was also in the basement. Every time I was down there painting, and even when I was at school, this thing would appear. I was convinced I was going mad. I ended up calling Caitlin and asked her if she remembered anything odd from when we were kids. She responded with something along the lines of, "Not really, besides the thing in the brush." Now I knew something weird was happening. She remembered the experience as vividly as I do, even though we hadn't spoken about it in almost a decade. I'd recently moved into my new house and figured that would be the end of it. But no. First night I was in the basement, the figure was back. I still see it to this day over 10 years later. I have no idea what it is. There's so much more to tell with this entity, including a near-death experience. I just wanted to put this out there, to see if anyone knew what it is. I worked in a rural district general hospital, and I had a few incidents. The first one when I was working night shift. Due to the hospital being so small, you were the only on-site doctor covering the medical and surgical ward. You also have to clerk any administration from the emergency department. The hospital was built into a hill, therefore there was a corridor running from the ED to the other end of the hospital. Where the ED was on the ground floor, to get to the wards, you would be in the basement at the far end of the hospital. I used to use this corridor all the time in the day as it ran under outpatients, and so you didn't have to navigate around people. Anyway, this one night shift, I was bleeped into the ward, so I was walking along this corridor. Halfway along it, I felt really uncomfortable. Something was staring into the back of my neck. I just felt overwhelmingly unsafe. I sprinted to the end of the corridor and ran up the stairs as I didn't want to wait down there for the lift. Subsequently, I found out that the corridor used to have the morgue on it, but was moved some years prior. I've never used that corridor again. My second story, working nights in the ED. A man had been in the clinical depressions unit, aka a kind of halfway house between the ED and wards. He was really unwell and was basically for end-of-life care, and he arrested and died at 11 p.m. At 4 a.m. I sat with the nurses at the nurses' station looking at the door to the room he'd been in. Huh? Sun must be coming up, I think to myself, seeing the light in the room slowly increasing. A few minutes later, the door to the room clicks open by itself. Once fully opened, I realized it wasn't the sun coming, but the emergency light that comes on in a power outage. However, the power was on everywhere else, and none of the other rooms have emergency lights on. A few minutes later, the electronic doors which control access to the department stop working altogether. One of the nurses laughs. "We forgot to open the window to let a spirit out," so she pops in to open the window. 5 minutes later, an alarm goes off at the far end of the department. It's the pressure alarm for the isolation room, basically a negative pressure room used for infectious patients to stop whatever pathogen is there being spread through the department. It has a sort of airlock, which if neither of the set of doors are open for a certain period will trigger an alarm. Nobody had been down there all evening. The room was empty apart from the deceased's patient mobility scooter which was being stored there. He obviously wanted to use it to get himself up. A few weeks ago, I was staying with my mum, grandfather and uncle in a small cottage in Cape Cod, probably built sometime in the late 60s. My mother and I were staying in a room with 2 twin beds about 6 feet apart on each side of a small room. We had driven there late and everyone was settling down to go to bed around 3 a.m. The very first night that we were there, it was around 3:30 and the lights were off and my mum was already asleep. Now I 100% know that I was tired at this moment, but I was completely awake. I'm getting chills just thinking about it. I was laying on my side in the direction of the bed, facing my mother, and suddenly I blinked, and the next thing I know, a pitch black shadowy figure with womanly features and long hair hanging down appeared in front of me, clear as day, and whispers, "Hey, shh." And for a short moment I thought it was my mum, but when I looked she was asleep and the figure was gone before I could react. I spent the next 2 hours freaking out, practically having an anxiety attack with my heart racing, trying to play off what I just saw. My mother doesn't believe in the supernatural and says it was my imagination, but I am a college-age man and know for a fact that I was completely awake when I saw and heard what I did. I felt incredibly uncomfortable in the room the next 3 nights, as we were there and slept facing the wall. I didn't even dare to flip over and face that wall again, and I swear I heard light footsteps the next few nights in that room, all aboard the Nope train. Picture this. You're in my bed. To the right of my bed on the wall is my closet. It doesn't have doors, just a curtain that I use to block it off. Except the curtain will move sometimes and reveal the inside of it. It's never bothered me until one night. I had a friend over and they fell asleep. I stayed up because I wasn't very tired. After an hour of being on my phone, I switched it off and turned to face my closet, which is when 2 circular red dots glared at me from the crack in the closet. I froze and tried to use one of my arms to slowly reach behind me and tap my friend awake. I guess whatever was in my closet noticed what I was doing, and I started to hear heavy breathing coming from there. I noticed the side of the curtain was moving in and out from the breathing. I started flipping out even more and turned around quickly to shake my friend awake. Right as my friend opened her eyes, she said, "Don't look at it," then sat up and screamed. I don't know what to do, but I looked back at my closet, and it was gone. I felt hot and dizzy. Then my friend asked if I was okay and why I woke her. I turned back to face her, and that was that. It is a little known fact that when you relinquish your phone number, it can be redistributed after a while. And I think the person who had my phone number before me was both a deadbeat and in with the wrong crowd, because I constantly got harassed by credit industries looking for this guy Juan, who isn't me, and I get crazy texts asking for Juan. This was normal in the beginning, and over time it started to die down. After having my phone number for 6 years, I was getting a call from this strange number with my same area code, but they were calling every 5 to 10 minutes. Normally I would block it, but it was the same number every time. So I was going to wait to Google the number to verify it was spam. Before I could get to Google, I get a text from the number that was calling me earlier that simply was saying a swear word in Spanish. Now, I'm white, but I knew what it meant. Usually at this point, I would just ignore it, then block the message, but I was intrigued because it wasn't a message promising me Russian hot singles in my area or any spam like that. So I decided to Google some Spanish comeback/insult and proceeded to barrage the messenger with some salty Spanish lingo. Needless to say, the messenger was less than thrilled with my response. This was when this went from amusing to straight up harassment. Later that day I received threats in my texts and constant calls. I tried in English, saying I'm not Juan and that I was just messing around. This didn't seem to work as they kept saying things like, "Liar, I know it's you, stop trying to hide." I was bored at this point and blocked their number. And the next day I get a text from a different number in Spanish telling me to watch myself. And, "You're dead." I decided to ignore this and blocked the numbers again. For a few weeks nothing happened. I figured they must have figured out that I wasn't this Juan they were looking for. But then I get a text, this time with a picture. I would have dismissed it, but the picture made me queasy. It was a picture of a tattooed man holding a piece of paper with my phone number, Juan's full name and address that thankfully wasn't mine, with a message saying in Spanish, "We're coming." What made the picture worse was that the man had a tattoo on his face that said MS-13 below his eye. At that time I had decided that I had enough, and decided to change my number at that point. It makes some sense as I was in a different state anyway. I didn't do anything past this because deep inside, I was hoping this was just a bad joke that was being played on either me or Juan. But if not, I hope they didn't find this Juan guy, or that they find me for that matter. It gives me hope that they didn't have my address. In 2 years since this happened, I haven't heard a peep. These two experiences happened several years ago, before my grandpa, a retired doctor, retired. The first experience happened to him while he was trying to get some sleep in his room. He says that right before he could fall asleep, he felt as if someone was pulling the covers at either side of him with great strength, keeping him in place. Immediately he started wrestling to get free, and he did so for around a minute, before the force disappeared. He then proceeded to turn on the lights and look around, but there was obviously no one else in the room, as only he had the keys. The second experience happened when he was in the dining room chatting with the nurses. Take into account this was a small, 2-story hospital, and that night there were no patients, when suddenly the power went out, and for some weird reason the emergency generator didn't go off. While everyone was still processing what was going on, the doors to the second floor started slamming closed, and multiple loud steps could be heard. Before my grandpa could calm down the nurses and reassure them, they stormed out the building, so he went after them. After a few minutes the power came back and everyone went back in, although hesitantly. My grandpa is very skeptic and doesn't believe in ghosts or any of that, but when I asked him what he thinks caused those incidents, he says he honestly doesn't know. Me and my friend were doing night shifts for a production at school, setting up the stage, etc. for the production later in the month. There were 2 janitors helping us with the setup, one of which went home for the night, both of which have a key to a closet. One of the usual school closets surrounded by rumors, said to have the bodies of children inside it. However, it just has the security monitors and broomsticks. The security cameras are always turned off, and are just for show. I needed the bathroom, so, being a wuss, me and my friend went to the restrooms, heading past the closet door as we went in. It was a little bit open, something that's a bit out of the ordinary, but we ignored it, and thought nothing of it. I greeted my friend as I came out of the stall and noticed another unordinary thing. The security camera outside the toilet was on. Being veterans of the school, I knew it was something to do with the open closet. Maybe the janitor turned the cameras back on. It was night shift after all, but it wasn't like them though. So we headed back to the hall to finish for the night again, passing the closet door as we went. We asked the janitor if he knew anything about the open door. He knew nothing about it. He said he would ask the other janitors in the morning. We finished for the night, leaving him to lock the closet and the gates we left from. The next day was pouring with rain. This time both janitors were there, agreeing that neither of us had used the closet in well over a week. My friend and I, being suspicious, did the same thing as we did the previous day and checked the door as we went down the hall towards the restroom. But this time it was wide open. A wet umbrella hung dismally from the center chair, surrounded by 3 monitors, all turned on, controlling the security cameras. I sent my friend to tell the janitors and stayed behind, looking at the room a bit more. The window to the left of the chair was open. It was small, but just large enough to fit someone of a small stature through it. After a while, the janitors came and saw the umbrella, and called the police after realizing that no one but them could enter the room, and the umbrella didn't belong to any of them. A week passed and I was freaked out by the incident and barely slept at all. The police investigation told the school that someone did in fact use the window to get into the closet room, and most likely use their monitors to check who was in the building. But they never managed to find the closet man, nor his motives for why he was in the school. When I was a kid, probably between 8 and 10, I used to see shadow people in the night. It happened almost every single night. It was so frequent that I just got used to them. They never scared me. When I saw them, they would just walk against the wall and watch me while I was in bed. I remember they never had clothes, they were just a figure or body. They used to open my door at night, and I'm pretty sure one of them whispered my name into my ear at night, before bed, while I was brushing my teeth. I was in the washroom with my cousin and sister brushing our teeth before bed. They finished before me, and I was alone upstairs and I could feel something behind me but didn't acknowledge it until I heard a really faint whisper of someone saying my name right into my ear. All I remember is freaking out and running downstairs screaming that someone just said my name. There was also this one time I was playing hide and seek with 3 of my siblings, and after finding 2 of them, we were looking for my sister and toys started being flung from her room. Being kids, we laughed it off, went running into the room looking for her. There wasn't anyone there, and we ended up finding her hiding in the basement. I also remember I used to suffer from 2 different night terrors when we lived in that house. One of them I still can't explain to this day. I can only draw a picture, but it's hard for me to do because of how traumatizing it was. The other was a dream of me walking down the basement and finding a little girl curled up in a ball in a box crying. The strange thing about that second dream is that my younger brother had the exact same dream. He's 17, I'm 23, and we still agree that's some messed up stuff going on in the house. Let me give you some context. This story happened about 10 years ago. In England, if you want to go to university, you have to apply through an agency called UCAS to get accepted or not. I didn't get the grades I wanted and was not accepted to any of the universities I had applied to, which was a big kick in the ovaries for me. However, there is this other process called clearing, which for those of us who tried really hard but didn't excel at the exams gives us a shot to get into a handful of schools. I was fortunate enough that I managed to secure a place via clearing and attend a local university. It was only an hour's drive away, but I was 18 and wanted freedom. My 3 sisters and my parents were a handful to deal with, especially as 2 of them were quite young, and my parents can be overprotective and overbearing at the least of times. So I elected to move out and rent a place up at university. Now, of course, most people who got their applications through earlier already had their spots reserved, which meant I was in a precarious position, as when I inquired into the local dorms and such, I found that there was no room for little old me. There was nowhere I could stay, which is how this story begins. I was looking on the internet to try and find a place to live, somewhere that had my budget in mind, but that wasn't far from the university. Otherwise, I could hardly justify the expense that it was going to cost to my parents, as I couldn't afford to pay rent without getting a loan in the first place, which is quite normal for people here in the UK. After about 3 days of searching, and growing less and less optimistic with the prospect of moving out, did I finally find on one of the last pages of the search page a decent property. The price was incredibly reasonable, and it was completely private too. It was a very small apartment as part of a house. It was on the upper part, but the house had been changed into 2 or 3 apartments. I had the top one, and it was, funnily enough, the largest. It also housed the attic, and the only condition was that I had to relinquish control of the apartment during the hours that someone needed to get access from the attic. But this was very unlikely. But it was important to the owners that they had access to it, and that I would be willing to work with them if they ever needed it, which I was totally cool with. 18-year-old me was ecstatic. I couldn't wait to get to my new place. Then September rolls around. I'm there early, at least 2 weeks before school starts, and I'm so excited to be dwelling in my new place. I can't wait to make friends, invite people over, and was absolutely delighted with how much bigger it was in person than I thought. It was bigger than all our upstairs in our old house. I had a living room, somewhere to put my modest TV, my gaming console, my laptop, my stereo. I had a kitchen, all of these cool things to myself, and I felt so happy. But there was something I need to let you know. The apartment had a weird, heavy feeling to it, a dark vibe. I don't really know how to describe it, but I never really felt super comfortable there. At the start, I just assumed that it was because I was moving out for the first time and was missing home. But despite the fact that I kept putting excuses up, as the days went by and I made it more personal, I still never felt any better about it. The day comes where uni starts. I'm having a blast. I've made a bunch of friends, and within the first few weeks I invite people over to a house party at mine. It was great fun, but one of my friends, called Trisha, told me she felt really weird in my bedroom. I asked her why. You see, Trisha had drank way too much, so we dragged her to my bed so that she could sleep it off while the rest of us continued drinking and chatting and listening to music. She said that while she was in bed, she heard the cupboard creak. That's where I kept my shoes. She said she saw someone peep out, and then it was gone. She was drunk, remember, so I don't know how credible this statement was, and honestly, none of us took notice about it. But a few weeks later, I was going to bed, and just as I was falling asleep, did I hear something, almost like a footstep. I look around my room, tell myself it's just house noises, and try to go back to sleep. About 15 minutes in, I'm tossing and turning and still uncomfortable. Something's annoying me. I feel like someone's watching me. I resort to putting on some YouTube to try and get myself to sleep. Maybe listen to some funny videos, just some background noise to help me lull. About 15 minutes into the video, I'm just silent, with the light shining on my table. And I hear it again. A little squeak. I start to get uncomfortable. It's behind me, so I slowly turn my body to look, and I see that my cupboard door is ever so slightly ajar. You need to understand something about me. I'm very anal when it comes to organization. I know I closed that cupboard because I had organized my shoes within it earlier that day, and I liked it the way I liked it. There's no way I could have left it open. This was bothering me. I wondered if perhaps it had broken at some point. So I got up, opened both doors wide, and there I see a face. I just about crapped myself. The face withdraws into the darkness, and as I flick my light on, I look, and there's nothing there. There's just a panel. Several wooden panels that make up the back of the wardrobe. I never even bothered to touch them before. I start to feel freaked out. So I start from the right and start banging on each individual panel. All 3 of them sound the same. I try to give them a shove, and they all feel solid enough. I put my ear up against the wardrobe, navigating past my shoes and hanging dresses and stuff, to get my ear right up against it. I can't hear anything. I wait a moment, and that's when I hear what sounds like someone pattering down some small stairs. What the hell is this, I thought. I didn't know what to do. I called my dad and told him I didn't feel comfortable and explained the situation. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and he really didn't want to take the hour drive to come up to see me and check out my room, as he had to be at work early in the morning. So, he agreed reluctantly after a little bit of convincing that he'd come down. He arrived, opened up my room and my closet, and had a poke around. He asked me how much my house deposit was, and after telling him he had an idea, he told me that he could break it to check. If there's nothing there, he'd fix it, paint it, and no one would be none the wiser, but that if there is, he knows there's something shady going on. He pushed with his hands, but it wouldn't budge, and that's when he got a hammer from his car and bashed it. With a few hits, the wooden panel splintered, and as he pushed it back, did we notice a light coming from behind it. It was only faint, and when we looked through, there was a tiny passage, almost like a crawl space, that led to some stairs. At this point, my father gulped. He was now very annoyed. We managed to go through, and he looked behind it. It was like a few latches. The panel could be easily removed, and by putting the latches back, no one would know that you could access it via this way. He was furious. We never found out for sure, but he was quite confident that the person who rented the apartment was the family member of a person who lived downstairs. It was a dude, early 40s, and I'd only seen him once in passing. He slept there that night, called in sick at work, and I called in sick at uni. We banged on the door downstairs to meet a very unpleasant and unkempt-looking guy. He asked us what we wanted, and he asked if he had anything to do with the guy who rented us the apartment. He said that they were family and that he could answer any questions we had. We were trying to play the idiot, pretend like we were completely oblivious to what we knew he was doing, and my dad told him to come upstairs and check something with him, that there was something funny under the bed. The guy was clueless. He came upstairs anyway, and when he got to the top, my dad showed him the hole and how they'd removed the panel. You could see the guilt etched on his face, and he claimed he had absolutely no idea of what we were talking about. But that's when my dad went into protective dad mode and started yelling at him, and told him that if they didn't give us our deposit back, the money we paid for rent, and a little bit more, that he would be calling the police for an invasion of privacy and who knows what else. The man quickly went downstairs, withdrew a whole load of money in cash, even more than what we'd asked for, gave it to us, and asked us please not to tell the police. But at that point my dad had had a change of heart. He told him to take his money and that he didn't care and that he was calling the police. They arrived, and it was a bit of a scene. Then the man actually got arrested. He got off though on some bullshit excuse, because it wasn't technically his house and which really annoyed me. Makes me think we should have taken the money, but ethically we simply couldn't do it. In any case, we moved out. We did get some money back, but it wasn't enough, and I ended up moving back home, because I didn't have enough to find a new place, as they were all incredibly expensive. But I learnt my lesson, and it was a creepy experience while being home alone, something I am now quite afraid to do. I went to post-secondary school in a very large, well-known American city. In my time there, nearly everyone I knew was eventually robbed or assaulted. Many of the stories were appalling and altogether frightening. I thought I was insulated by self-awareness, but I was wrong. When I moved to this city, it was a culture shock. Country boy to big city in one night. The learning curve was steep. I lived in a large, semi-enclosed city centre. Tall apartments housed students from around the world attending a variety of institutions. We had our own mall, art centre, restaurant, etc. in this large complex sitting near the edge of downtown. There were a limited number of exits from our somewhat gated community into the surrounding city. It felt safe. Most students walked several large blocks through a brief industrial section and then crossed a massive bridge into the downtown area and either entered institutions there or caught mass transit to their destination. Buses, subways, taxis. Midway through my time at school, I was walking home alone one evening. My large portfolio bag, weighed with tools and tablets, hung by my side. It was mid-fall and getting dark quickly. Cool air came down from the hills, but waves of the day heat collected in the concrete and pavement and wafted up and swarmed around me. Coupled with the smell of fall and the energy of the city, it was intoxicating and distracting. To enter the complex from downtown, you need to ascend 2 large wide cement stairways, all the way up the final third set of a very high stair to pass through a mall which loomed above. All around were large planters and girthy pillars. It was a busy-looking large area with benches, curves and hidden spaces. I guess that's why I didn't notice him until I was nearly halfway to the final staircase. Then, suddenly, the appearance of a man in a trench coat, staring at me only 20 or so feet away, snapped me out of my daydream. I was always very alert when moving through the city, having heard many horror stories about students being ambushed by criminal lowlives, but I felt safe here with all the space around me, and had uncharacteristically let my guard down. I gauged the distance, his body language, the possibility that he may have unhealthy motives, and decided to play it cool and keep moving up the steps. If he moved towards me, I would bolt. If not, chalk it up to nerves. I was relieved to start climbing the stairs while he stood still and continued to look at me. I was smug that I was no longer in any danger. I would reach the double doors to the mall and be gone. As the stairs turned near the top, I casually looked back down some 40 feet to the courtyard. He was staring up at me and smiling. Relieved, I reached for the door handle, safety inches away, visible through the large glass doors. But it was dark. I tugged on the door, which refused to open. It was locked. It was later that I thought the mall had closed. Crap. I stood there for a moment, collecting myself. I had to go through the parking garage back down a level. The only other option was to make my way back out to the road and circle the massive complex on an empty sidewalk at night until I found another way in. I still felt very aware of the man in the coat. Would he approach me? Would he corner me? Was he armed? What if he wanted more than money? He looked crazy. And that smile. I pulled myself together and started back down the stairs. I couldn't see him anywhere. Perhaps he left. Without being certain of his motives or location, every step I took gave rise to increasing anxiety. I reached the bottom, moving cautiously, and looked towards the parking entrance. It was a lot of ground to cross, and there was far more cover for my would-be psycho than I was comfortable with. I was frozen, carefully scanning the scene and listening intensely. I was altogether unsure of myself, but needed to make a choice. Without knowing where he had gone, both options before me held equal peril. Back out to the road, into the dark, or forward, past the pillars and planters big enough to conceal him, into the enclosed garage, where no one would hear my shouts of distress. Just as I was about to move, I heard laughter and voices coming from the road. A group of people emerged into the lit area and began climbing the wide stairs facing downtown. I felt a rush of peace, and smiling to myself, I stepped in behind them and began following them towards the garage entrance. I was congratulating myself inwardly for my good fortune, and my savvy, my fear melting away. Just as I entered the garage after them, I looked back, and he was there, smiling broadly with his arms buried in the pockets of his trench coat. Our eyes locked, and his broad grin widened further, stretching over his thin lips over his teeth. He was standing right smack in the middle of the entrance I passed merely seconds ago. He must have been hiding behind a pillar that I was only a few feet away from. I looked down at his drab-clothed frame and took notice that his arms appeared to be at his side, despite being in his pockets, which were high up on his waist. I didn't notice how unnatural that looked when I first saw him. His pockets must have been cut through, because I could make out the shadow of an object he seemed to be holding in his hands beneath the coat. So dirty, smiling, criminal lowlife. Let's not meet again. I grew up in a house that was home to a malevolent entity. If not malevolent in nature, I do firmly believe that this entity fed off negative emotions and energy. My family being largely dysfunctional and abusive, the entity was well nourished. It was free to roam the house. There's pretty much no part of the house I didn't see it in at some point, although it was mostly seen around the staircase. Hence the nickname Stairwell Demon my sister and I used on the ground floor. The Stairwell Demon presented itself as a large, gangly shadow figure. Think Slender Man, but just darkness and only one set of arms. A very vivid memory of mine is the Stairwell Demon coming into my room at night, sitting on the floor while staring at me and getting into my wardrobe. Since then, I have been absolutely petrified of wardrobes. Now, I have left my family and that house behind. While I did have paranormal experiences in my first apartment, I've never seen the Stairwell Demon anywhere but in my childhood home. Something that always struck me as odd was how in movies and stories a lot of the spirits/entities seem to be focused on closets and wardrobes, or at least to seem somewhat fond of them. Any ideas what this could be? This was roughly 7 years ago, and I worked night shift on a psychiatric ward in the north of Sweden. I didn't believe in ghosts, but some strange shenanigans were quite often heard in the floor above my ward, at the doctor's office. It sounded like someone was moving furniture a few minutes every now and then. We had a nickname for the sounds, simply the ghost. One very calm night on the ward, the sound went on for much longer than expected, so me and my 2 colleagues decided to search for the source of the sound. When we went upstairs, we could easily pinpoint the dragging and slamming noises to one particular office of a certain psychiatrist. As soon as we opened the door, it went completely quiet. We stood there for a time baffled, and one of my colleagues let out a "hello?" and as a response, 2 of his desk drawers opened fast and violently. We ran away. The sound was almost on a nightly basis. I might add it isn't the only strange experience I've had, but it was definitely the most frightening and hardest to rationalize of them all. When I was 7, I lived in a small apartment with my mum, her boyfriend at the time, and 2 siblings, 1 brother, 1 sister. My brother was a few years younger than me, and my sister was only a few weeks/months older. I shared a room with my brother for a while, but I kept waking up in the middle of the night, and I thought he was the one waking me up every night, so I told my mum. She moved my brother into a spare room, so now I was sleeping in this room alone. I went to bed as usual, thinking I wouldn't be disturbed in the middle of the night, so I was kind of happy. I remember waking up in the middle of the night and looking out my window. It was late at night, and there was someone outside with their dogs, so I figured the dog barked and woke me up. I rolled over to get out of bed and go to the bathroom. That's when I saw the dark outline of a man standing in my closet. He was tall, average build, and had deep, glowing red eyes. I froze. I felt like I physically couldn't move, and I remember hiding under my blanket and falling back asleep. This repeated for about a week before I refused to sleep in that room and started sleeping on the couch. My mum got into a fight with her boyfriend one night and slept in my room so she wouldn't have to deal with him. What I remember from her story is this. As she was about to fall asleep, she felt the bed shake. This couldn't have been explained by any pets, since we hadn't got any, and no one else was home. She ran out the room and was obviously shaken. A few weeks later, my aunt slept over, and as she was young at the time and had nothing to do for the weekend, she slept in my room, despite my mum warning, and the bed was dragged towards the closet. She ran into my mum's room, visibly shaken, and wouldn't leave. Looking back on this a few years ago, I thought it was just my imagination, until my mum told me the rest of the story a few months ago. My stepdad said it was a demon living in my closet. There's a well-known folklore in my town about the man in blue. In our town there is a very small hospital that attends minor ailments and sometimes care for the elderly. My mother worked there for many years. There's this folklore about the man in blue, you see. Lots of people have seen him, and even the local paper has reported on him several times during its run. It's not just known to the staff, it's known to the entire town. Sometimes on Halloween, people will gather around to see if they can get a glimpse of the man in blue from the window. Obviously they're not allowed inside, but in the spirit of things, the hospital will give out candy or leave out bowls to those dressed spookily. In any case, my mum worked there for many a year and only had one thing happen to her that convinced her the apparition was very real indeed. She was attending a family friend of my grandfather's, a friend that he had grown up with in the village for a long time. He was reaching the end of his life, and my mum had to administer some kind of injection and just check up on him. Usual routine stuff. She was sitting and chatting with him when she realized she needed something from the other room. So she nipped out to get it quickly while he waited. Just as she was coming back, did she see a man in blue enter the room. She wondered who it was, and as she entered the room, she asked where the man in blue went. He confirmed that he'd never seen anyone, and she'd only been gone about 2 minutes. She shook her head. She must be tired. And so she applied the injection, and that was that. But that very same night, he passed away from a stroke. It was very unexpected, because that wasn't what was ailing him. But in any case, it was sad for the whole town. He was a very well-known and beloved character. My mum spoke about the event a few weeks later with some co-workers, saying that she'd seen a man in blue enter and how he passed away that same day. They told her it was definitely the antics of the man in blue, the well-known ghost. But there was one thing that the nurses didn't like to talk about the man in blue and his characteristics. It is often said that when he shows up, it's an omen of death, and the person he comes to visit is often the one who passes. Some people say he was a doctor who used to work here long ago, and he comes back to check out patients who are on their way out. I was sleeping pretty tight, and I think it was something like 2 to 3 p.m. You know, when inside your house is totally dark, but not that pitch black darkness, more like a bluish darkness. Anyway, I was sleeping like a rock. Trust me, because I woke up all of a sudden without the sound waking me up, and the door of this room was open. I can clearly see the short corridor and part of the living room. And then I looked to the living room to see something tall, 100% black, and wearing something like a coat, standing near my boyfriend's grandma's feet, and I was paralyzed. I stared at the entity for a minute or so, and it wasn't even bothered that I was looking. I looked to my boyfriend's bed, but he was asleep, and I wanted so badly to wake him up, but I was scared that if I moved, I would rouse the thing and it would approach me. Maybe if I stand up or stick my leg pretty close to his, I'll wake him, I thought. But I was afraid the entity would look my way. So I tried pressing my eyes together to see if it was a hallucination. But it didn't vanish. It was standing there like a real person. So after deciding that I couldn't do anything about it, I closed my eyes with my heart pounding on my chest and fell asleep. In the morning, I heard from my mother-in-law that his grandma wasn't feeling well and had to go to the hospital. I can't say how freaked out I was, but I didn't tell her because she's skeptic. But I told my boyfriend what happened, and from that day on I've always been afraid to wake up in the middle of the night, in case I see something I don't want to. This didn't happen to me, but my mother last night at 3 a.m. My mum is really hard to scare. It takes more than a simple jump scare for her to flee a room. My mum was watching TV with us and fell asleep on the couch in her room. She woke at the middle of the night because she was freezing cold. So she grabbed her blanket and wrapped it around herself for warmth and walked to bed. Facing her closet, she began to fall asleep when she watched her closet door open slowly. A man, darker than the darkness of her room, walked out and faced her. "Suzanne," it said. He was about to say something else, but before he could, she bolted out the room. She said that it's giving her the feeling that she knew someone was going to die. One weird thing about it was that it wasn't sleep paralysis. I know most of you won't believe me, but I'm terrified. And if you know anything that can help, please tell me. I was 16 when this occurrence happened. It was 2:40ish in the morning. I tend to stay up late. It's something I did a lot in my teenage years. I went out to the kitchen to fill my water bottle up, and I also ended up grabbing a snack. As I turned to go back to my room, I saw something through my sliding glass door. I should reiterate I was living in an apartment at the time, all the way up on the 3rd floor. I thought I was just seeing something, but I started to walk over to the door and it got closer. I'm telling you, I just about crapped myself. I ran to my room so fast, it really freaked me out. Also, after that had happened, it occurred many other occasions. I'm so glad we finally moved out of that place. So many things happened. I used to work nights at hospital as a security guard. The work can be pretty dull, as for the most part people are quite decent and behaving, so there's not an awful lot to do. Maybe make sure no one steals from the vending machines, I suppose. Anyway, this happened one odd evening. I was just at my little booth, trying to read a book, when all of a sudden, there's a commotion outside the front door. I jump out and go to see what's going on. There's a man. All he's dressed in are socks and a really long coat. He starts freaking about and flailing on the floor. I called into the hospital for help to see if there was anything they could do. I had no idea what was going on. And a few nurses rush out and see if he's all right. The man was flopping like a fish. The eyes went to the back of his skull, and he was very much having a fit of some kind. The doctors and nurses try to restrain him, get a gurney in, and take him inside to keep watch on him and see what's going on, and try and talk to him, as he was just muttering and gibbering. Obviously, I didn't hear straight away what was going on. I work security and am not a medical professional. But one of my friends who was a nurse in there comes out, and she tells me all that's gone on with that guy, as I was legitimately quite concerned for him. She told me that he would be alright, but that he had taken something very dangerous, and that his life was in mortal peril. He was lucky that he made it to the hospital in time. Things could have been really bad. That's not the end though. They saved the guy, but a few nights later, he came back, clawing his way to the hospital door, still having a fit. It was the most bizarre thing. I couldn't believe he had returned. So I call back to someone else, and they come and try and escort him in. They get him on a gurney and he's flailing, and they're trying to talk to him and get control. But on that night, he took too much of whatever he took, and he passed away in the hospital. It was a dark day for me. It's pretty numbing to see someone in okay health, and then to be gone in a flash. A few months after this happened, I had all but forgotten about the strange man. When I saw him again, he just walked past the hospital door and vanished. The thing is, I was zoned out, just staring out the window. My book had gotten a bit boring, so I was just thinking about nothing. And obviously seeing this figure catches my attention. I look at him intensely, wondering how in the world he's there. It took my brain a few seconds to realize he was dead. And when I look, he passes my little window and vanishes. I step out the booth, look out, and there's no way he could have made it more than a few paces without me seeing. But he's simply gone. There's nowhere he could have gone. The hospital is colossal. There is literally no place he could have gone that I wouldn't have seen him at. This really confused me. At first, I thought that my nurse friends were playing a trick on me, and the patient hadn't actually passed away, as of course I'd never seen the body. Not that I needed to, their word was enough. But when I spoke to them about it, she gave me a confused look. "Oh, you've seen him too?" she said. "He likes to wander around the ground floor. I didn't know he also went outside." Turns out, after he passed, he's been spotted in several places around the hospital, just walking and then vanishing. Certainly unsettling for all us security and nurses. Anyway, that's my story. I live in a house that's not too old. It was handmade by the original owners, and only 2 families have resided here. Since I've been here, I've felt as if I'm never alone, always watched, and have had strange experiences. While there's no logical reason to get into them, this experience is seriously freaking me out. A few months ago, I was sorting through coins with a friend when he found 2 coins that were different. They were bent and scratched to the point where the copper was gone and revealed the zinc underneath it. Obviously, he asked me if I'd done it, and I told them that I found them while sorting through my closet. At the time, I didn't think much of it. People have weird-ass coping mechanisms and interests. We make a common joke that the supposed ghost that makes me feel followed is named Keith, and it's also a recurring joke that he lives in my closet. So we joked it was him and didn't think too much of it. Fast forward to March 28th this year. I'm currently in my room. As of a few minutes ago, the pennies were sitting on my dresser along with some jewellery. But this is no longer the case. I was watching TV and decided to light some candles, one being on the dresser. After lighting them, I noticed the pennies were gone. I've checked the carpeting under the floors, behind my dresser, and the drawer, and everywhere it's physically possible for them to be, but I can't find them. Perhaps my brain is playing a trick on me, or I subconsciously moved them somewhere else. But if anyone has any information on this freaky stuff, I'd really appreciate it.